construction in my kitchen because of flooding from the ceiling. So
Oh,
I thought this would be a difficult seminar to run with banging and sawing going on. So I thought we'd move it to today. So my apologies to anyone who's watching this recording because I couldn't make it today because we moved it to today. But this was the only viable way to do it this week. So for those just joining us, on probably by the YouTube channel, this is the Kenneth Smith seminar. We're continuing our multi-year run through his forthcoming book, Millennia and Microcosm, all the chapters of which, at least the current versions of the chapters, were published in the 1998 to 2001 timeframe as installments, as columns in the back of a magazine called the Comics Journal. And the column was called End Times, a title that Kenneth hates. He says the real name is Millennia and Microcosm. End Times was supposed to be the name of the interview that he gave at the beginning. It appeared as the first installment, but somehow it got attached to the column itself, and he doesn't want us to call the book that. This is, oh, it says 116 in the chat. That's wrong. Last week was 116. This is week 117 in the Millennia and Microcosm series. So you can tell that we're nuts because we are working our way very carefully through this book. And the reason we're doing that is that Kenneth Smith writes in a fantastic style, but it's very dense. It's very, very dense. And most of the words don't mean what we think they mean. So you really have to, unpack his language to see what he's talking about. He's really not concerned with whether he attracts a large audience. He'd much rather attract a very small audience and successfully communicate with them. So we work our way carefully through the book. The first three chapters were sort of introductory. The fourth chapter represents 1/3 of the material of the book, not in length, but in significance. As in one chapter, he covers the ancient worldview. Oh, Ari's asking privately, did I say there's a YouTube channel that links to these meetings? Yes, there is a YouTube channel. David Roel can give you the information. But if you just search for David Roel's channel on YouTube, you'll find all the Millennia and Microcosm Kenneth Smith philosophy seminar videos there. So we've been on chapter 4, which we spent most of the last 2 years on, was covering the entire ancient worldview. We're now about to go through a series of maybe 10 or so chapters, I haven't counted them, that are going to talk about the medieval worldview. And the reason for the difference is that Kenneth Smith taught the ancient Greek philosophy so many times during his career as a philosophy professor at university that he can do it in his sleep. He's really able to very densely summarize an enormous amount of material, which is what he does in chapter 4, which is why it took us so long. These chapters that follow, starting with chapter 5, aren't going to take us as long. They're not as densely written, although they're very interesting. And they're going to cover the next major epoch of European history, from circa somewhere around the fall of Rome to circa somewhere around the, Enlightenment, Renaissance, Reformation kind of area. And then the final chapters in the book will talk about the modern worldview. And the whole purpose of this book is that all of us as moderns have been growing up marinating in the modern worldview to such an extent that we have no idea the extent to which it shapes our understanding. It's like the water that fishies swim in. Fishies can't discover water because it's everywhere all the time for them. The modern worldview is everywhere all the time for us. We take it for granted. We think we know who we are, but we don't actually know what kind of filters we have on the way we see the world. So the purpose of this book is to teach us how to look at the world through the medieval, through the ancient worldview, then to teach us how to look at the world through the medieval worldview and to compare the medieval and the ancient. And then finally, in the final chapters, to look at how moderns see the world using the ancient and the medieval as a frame of reference to help us get outside of the labyrinth that we normally think within. And once we can do that, then we get to where we can have some voluntary control over our interpretation of the world. We don't take everything for granted all the time, the way a modern does naturally, as we've been artificially acculturated to do. We'll understand what modernity is for the first time when we can look at it from outside of itself. So, oh yes, thank you, Donald. There it is, computer power and human reason. So the purpose of this exploration, there's two critical things about it. I do these intros from time to time. I'm going to do this one now. There's two reasons for this. And the first one is, it is absolutely not to establish which one is right. No human worldview will ever be right. The end, period. We're never going to reach a point where we're like gods and we see the world as it actually is. That's impossible. And the way we know it's impossible is that compared to the size and lifespan of a human being, the world is essentially infinite. Whereas the size of the conscious mind is about 7 plus or minus 2 variables in our conscious mind that we can keep track of. We rely heavily on our unconscious mind to do a lot of the work for us. And our unconscious mind is not only full of facts, it's full of dreams and fantasies and fiction that we read, and Luke Skywalker fighting Darth Vader and all kinds of crap is in there. It has nothing to do with objectivity. It's a bigger picture than that. So we are not trying to establish that any one of these three worldviews is correct. Especially, we're not trying to establish that the modern worldview is correct, although this is hard for a modern to deal with. We always want to prove that we're right and everybody else is wrong. It's right there in the name, modern. We're praising ourselves. We're the modern ones. We think we're the best. We're also not trying to, and as part of that, if we praise some features of the ancient worldview, we're not saying we wish we were Greeks. If we praise some features of the medieval worldview, we're not trying to say we wish we were medievals. None of these perspectives is the right one. They each have their strengths and weaknesses. And if we get to where we can learn to see through multiple worldviews, then we can swap in and out which strengths and weaknesses we have that we bring to the problem that we're talking about in a given moment. That's a whole lot better than being the man with the hammer to whom the whole world looks like a nail, which is where we are until we do an exercise like this. But the second thing about the purpose of this, it's also not trying to say there were only 3 epochs or worldviews in human history. These are 3 documented worldviews. Literate civilizations wrote down the way they saw the world, and they wrote in enough detail and with enough cross-cultural comparisons that we can use them as frames of reference. There are doubtless other frames of reference. And the purpose of this is to get to where, having done 3, we should then be able to go out and explore. We could explore ancient Chinese worldviews, medieval Chinese worldviews, medieval Japanese worldviews, all kinds of worldviews from India that are documented. And then with practice, we might get to where we can engage with cultures that only have an oral tradition and try to see if we can learn to see through their worldviews. So it gets to where we try to stop being the man with the hammer and start being a person who has a big toolbox full of all kinds of perspectives that could be used. I want to liberate ourselves from the trap of the mind. That's the purpose of this book. And that's what we're doing now in chapter 5. We're just starting into the medieval civilization. This is only our 3rd session on the medievals. You haven't missed much. If you're just jumping in here, you can go back to YouTube and watch the previous 2, and you're totally caught up as far as the medievals. And as time goes on, we'll be cross-comparing the medievals with the ancients, and that'll give you a chance to see those things. All of the text is up on the KennethSmithPhilosophy.com website that David Royal shares, and it's on the invite for this session, for each of these sessions. So, and anybody who comes in who has questions, feel free to ask them. We love talking about this stuff. Let's start with Q&A. Donald, what's on your mind?
Oh, I think there's one other thing, is that Kenneth doesn't really prove the correctness of his expositions of what the key features of these epics are. And 40 years ago, I thought that was a weakness. And I'm now inclined to think that it's about all you can do. That somehow we can't grasp these complex systems in their wholeness in any definitive way. And so there's no point blaming somebody for doing something that can't be done. He has a, it's like when you get these books. I know one of the books that Kenneth is The Italians, where they try to sum up what it means to be an Italian. Well, they're all different kinds of Italians, and there's an exception to everything you'd say about them. There'll be some Italian that won't fit. And it's probably the same thing here. I don't, that's just, wait, he's describing something. He's not saying there's no deductive argument that proves that this view of the civilization is right. And I guess I'm just saying, don't reject what he says because of that. see what you can learn from the way he views these epics. That's it. That's enough. It's just, oh yeah, there it is. I always like that's his, you know, the British say don't kick a man when he's down. The Italians say there's no better time. And he quotes that from,
Yeah.
you know, a difference in national character.
Cultures are different from each other is the point of this.
Right.
And sometimes somebody pops out with something that's totally in character for their culture that makes everybody else in the room go,
Well, I think he got that from Barzuni.
He did.
He mentions it all the time. And
Yeah.
I just think of it, like whether true or not, it's insightful into the
Yes.
difference between cultures. Enough of
Yes.
me talking.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, I mean, Kenneth is not concerned with whether anybody believes what he's saying or not. And he's not trying to create a perfect, pure, provable system. He sort of scoffs at those things as sort of, masturbatory fantasies of hyper intellectuals who are desperately trying to protect themselves from having an honest conversation with anyone. No, no, I have all of my defenses arrayed. Look, it's perfect, it's pure. It's like, well, the world is very complicated and full of paradoxes. So if your logic is perfect and pure, that's the clearest evidence we have that your system doesn't describe reality. Human attempts to describe reality always involve a lot of contradiction, roughness, and paradox. And if that's all missing, if it's just a pure crystalline perfect system, then it's bullshit. It's just a fantasy. He says, all philosophy is either escapist or existentialist. It's the only two kinds there are. An existentialist means first you privilege the way things actually are. And escapist means no, no, I don't like the way things actually are. Let me postulate this beautiful logic. That's nice. What a nice logic. There. Go sit in the corner, be happy, talk with your friends. Meanwhile, some of us are trying to figure out how the world works. The other thing that's great about Kenneth, where this stuff is concerned, is that um, because he doesn't think there's a single right answer, one of the ways he used to teach philosophy, and I don't know if he did this when Donald was taking his classes, but he talks about it sometimes, is that he would stand up in front of the classroom and assume two different philosophical positions. He'd say, okay, so Aristotle and Kant walk into a bar, and now they're going to have a conversation about free will. Here goes. And then he'd hop back and forth between the two perspectives, and he'd argue each one as forcefully as he could. It's like, what would Kant really say? Well, how would Aristotle feel about that? And this idea of, escaping the trap of trying to find the one true answer and instead looking to see what does each philosopher have to offer us, and not just the philosophers, what does the literature have to offer us, the art, the music, it's all the possible sources of meaning and inspiration. What does each one have to offer? What are its strengths and weaknesses? So that's what he's doing here with these worldviews of these different epochs in this book. He's like, each of them has its crazy, crazy qualities. Some of the qualities are totally batshit crazy, but they also have their virtues. So it's kind of what we're up to here. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it would be a funnier joke if Aristotle had met the cart in the bar, and Aristotle asked the cart, would you like to buy me a drink? The cart says, I think not. And the argument disappears because Aristotle now is alone. That would be a better discussion about that. Anyway, so I learned I learned a couple of things this week that's important, and one of them I'm going to say right now, and it really related to what I said before. It was in a Heidegger meeting, and Nick, who's in that meeting, I respect Nick a lot because he's questioning a lot of things. And he says, in terms of pre-Socratic, particularly, he's defending it, that the problem with Plato and Platonism is that he presented an idea, and you kind of made fun of idea about calling it ideology rather than ideology. Okay, he went further, and he says this was a sort of icon. So what they did was presented the idea as a kind of icon. So icon is kind of a uh, kind of like idol. He called it an idol. It's that the words themselves fossilized into idol. And I was thinking back, I immediately looked up, and I looked up before last week at the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it does say in the beginning of the Old Testament that God created the universe uh, and the earth uh, was formless and void. Darkness would hover over the surface of the deep, which is sort of interesting. Sounds very Freud. And and the Spirit of God hover over the surface, and God said, "Let there be light." So there was that deep in a sense. It wasn't word. I guess God did say, he used words and said, "Let there be light." And the New Testament, in terms of John, said, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God." So far, it's probably okay because God did say, "Let there be light," and the Word was God. So the ideas became the real. And that reminded me, what when what's his name? The Moses went up to Mount Sinai and met the burning bush that gave him the Ten Commandments. And he came down, and the decisive moment wasn't when he received the Ten Commandments. They were worshiping idols. Words. Okay, you could translate that into words. Idols. And he got so angry that he threw the tablet down, and the tablet fractured. And that was the intervention of man in relationship to idols. And so that was interesting, that the transformation of the ideas from suke to logos was, in a sense, embedded in the Platonic ideal. Not that Plato played that game, but certainly Plotinus and then Augustine brought it into this sort of idol worship of the divine, which, by the way, is the same thing Moses scorned that, because they were worshiping the golden calf, another kind of idol. So in some sense, the Middle Ages was involved with a deeper idol worship. And so in some sense, we at the moderns, although we sort of negated that, I guess, through a series of uh, disbeliefs, from idols to icons, to symbols, and then to signs. And now the signs have denuded it into an atheist form of idol worship. And that's where we're caught in. We are still worshiping idols, although it no longer has that religious symbolic significance. So that was a very, very interesting talk that he gave, the transformation of suke to idol worship. And that's where the problem is. I was shocked when I heard that, but in some sense, it seemed to make sense, because when you got somebody like Derrida, who was laboring over the text, and the text is the thing that has the prime significance. Everything's in the text and the relationship of the text of the idol to each other. Then, in some sense, it is on the surface, not in the deep. So
Thank you for
that's very, very interesting. I
that.
thought I would share that with you, since we're going into the Middle Ages of idol
Yes.
worshiping. Okay.
I appreciate it. We'll have time to go into this in depth as we go ahead. We'll probably be working our way through the medieval section for the next year or two, based on the pace at which we went through the ancient worldview. So far, as you may recall, the opening paragraph, we've got the three quotes from Luke and John and Nietzsche, and then we have the one opening paragraph which I broke into two when I shared it, so that it would fit in the limitations of the Zoom chat. All of this is just introducing. This is the opening of chapter 5. We're just introducing medieval civilization, and we're introducing it. Kenneth Smith is introducing it to us in direct opposition to the ancient worldview. We talked about this a little bit last week. To every sentence of this opening paragraph brings up some issue that we've talked about in depth for the last 2 years about the ancient worldview, and shows how the medieval perspective 100% inverts the ancient value system. Where does meaning come from? What is the nature of nature? What is the nature of the gods? Where does humanity fit into this whole schema? All of this has been radically overturned by the medieval revolution that launches the medieval epoch. And so these issues of what is spirit, what is the word? I mean, for example, logos, we translate it as word, and that's a way to translate the word logos. But that's certainly not the way Heraclitus meant it. Right? We spent a bunch of time talking about Heraclitus, and he's obsessed with the logos. He won't stop talking about it. And for him, the logos goes far beyond a word. It's like the secret language of nature. What are the laws of nature? What are the principles of nature? What is the order underneath the surfaces, beneath the grass, beneath the trees? He doesn't know anything about DNA, but he can see the effects of DNA in the way that things replicate or don't replicate, in the way that two oak trees are both at the same time similar, but at the same time different. And so nature has this confusing, complex order underneath it that's highly adaptive and responsive. And he calls this the logos. Well, prior to Augustine importing a lot of Plato into medieval Christianity, early Christianity was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. Just like we talked a little bit about it last week and the week before when we were looking at these opening quotes. Why the use of paradoxes in Luke and John? Well, because paradoxes are Heraclitus's favorites, and a lot of other Greek philosophers are reveling in paradox as well. And so, if you have a new upstart movement that's attempting to be a response, a bold response to ancient philosophy, it has to speak the language of ancient philosophy in order to engage its audience, to have a hope of converting them. So the use of logos in John, we may translate it as word because we've got a dictionary that says so, but that doesn't mean that's what John had in mind at all. John might have been talking about Heraclitus's logos specifically. If Heraclitus says the world always was and is and shall be, and which he says, that's one of the fragments of Heraclitus. he discusses an eternal world that doesn't have a beginning. And in other quotes, he talks about the way that, the logos is ever present in everything that happens in the world. Everything that happens according to the logos. There's a logic, an order to everything. And the world is causal. It's not random. Then you can read John not as talking about words, but as saying, so that logos that all you Greeks are so obsessed about, that Heraclitus talks about, that's everywhere and that controls everything? Well, we think that too, but with one additional detail. We think the logos is with God, and God is the logos, so the logos is God. So if you believe your stuff, then you can believe our stuff. You see, it's a rhetorical argument that's being used, and for a specific audience, and it makes a certain kind of sense in that frame. But moderns barely know who Heraclitus is. They certainly don't know what the ancient worldview is, and the idea of the logos as not literally meaning a word is hard for us, because our dictionary says words. So we're like, well, that we believe in an equality that translations always get most of the original sense and that they don't miss anything. So it's easy for us to overlook the possibility that John is actually having a conversation with Greek culture when he uses the word logos, rather than talking about word. Now, this is not saying that's literally what he did. It's just saying this is a complex topic. When we're trying to read Luke or Matthew or John or Mark or any of these other works, we have to recognize that we're not the audience. The modern worldview that we all share and that we barely even recognize within ourselves, the power that it has over us to change the way we interpret the world, that interpretive framework didn't exist at all back when these people were writing. What did exist was the ancient framework that they were busy refuting, that they were trying to overthrow and overturn. And they succeeded, right? They created the medieval epoch through a successful revolution against the ancient worldview. So it's kind of like how, when I was a kid, I would sit in on adult conversations and I didn't understand most of what was going on. But from time to time, someone would say a word that I did understand, like dinosaur. I was really into dinosaurs as a kid. And so they might say, that political party is a dinosaur and it's not going to work. It'll be gone soon. And I would pipe into the conversation, go, "Ooh, dinosaurs! Did you know Triceratops has 3 horns?" And all the adults would look at me like, "Oh God, now we're talking about dinosaurs." This is what it's like when moderns engage with these ancient texts. We assume that they're talking to us and that they're speaking our language and that they, want to be meaningful to us, but they were talking to each other. They were having a different conversation than the one that we sort of are butting into. It's what makes it hard to read Aristotle. It's hard to read Aquinas. It's hard to read Luke, any of these things, because there is this different framework. It's part of what's handy about this book that Kenneth Smith has written here. See, in chapter 4, he gives us a chance to really see into the ancient worldview. And then maybe we can start to figure out, what are these guys actually arguing about? What are they concerned about? What does John care about? What does Mark care about? What does Luke care about? And so forth. Anyway, it's just an additional enrichment to the conversation. Likewise, Phil, the thing about the face of the Lord moved upon the surface of the waters. There's an interesting. Oh, Diana, did you have a question? You wanted to jump in? Come on. You can come off mute if you'd like to. Okay. So there have been some interesting archaeological discoveries that in the it doesn't let you unmute. It should. Here, I can say ask to unmute, and then you can see if the 3 dot. There you go.
No, it's just interesting because I'm reading St. Augustine, but I was just wanting to enrich that. What I have come to understand is that I think it's Aristotle who says that everything is mass and form. And so my understanding is that language is that a spiritual manifestation with which things are framed and are brought out of the ocean of the chaos. Like without language, there is no clear division in the mass. So what I have seen also is that every time the Bible speaks about the Spirit of God that is moving above the waters, the Spirit of God seems to be the will of God. So when even a bad prophet tells the truth, it is said that he has the Spirit of God, right? Because he's carrying his will in the truth. And so for me, language is a participant of creation, and in a way, men reflect the image of the Father in that we are able to categorize and bring in a limited way, right? Order out of the chaos. So even in psychology, we used to see how people who are deeply troubled emotionally are able to heal by just bringing that dirty water to have form with language. And so what I have come, again, I can be wrong, but I have figured that is the will of God, the Spirit of God over the potential. And so that chaos and that face of the deep that is dark is a space in which God is not. And it's interesting that God brings his will in the place where he is not, because God is not chaos, nor he is dark, as taught in the Bible. And so it seems a process by which he brings light into the darkness without forcing it to be in it, since he gave it will. But I would say the nature of the material of creation is darkness. And the reason why he blessed it is because it doesn't have the intrinsic nature of God. And so in that potential of creation in which God created things, I would say that spiritually speaking, for us, it's easy to conceptualize those terms, right? Like we have the hovering of the light that is God, hovering over that dark void, right? And so what I think is that it represents the fact that when God made men, he made men without men wanting to be born. Like he stepped into an authoritative place almost, and men didn't decide to be born. And so he stepped into that which has not his nature because we know the spirit of the nature is it's a spirit that wants to love, is born out of the desire. And I find interesting that in Genesis 2, it's almost like God gives the precondition for that spirit to be born of love. And so when Eve is made, God made men to count the animals, to name them, right? Again, that image of bringing order out of chaos, right? There was no dogs or pigs, or it was just a mass of animals. And it's through that categorization that order can be brought out of the chaos. And when Eve was made, what I see is the reflection of what God is trying to show, that it needs to be as a precondition for love. So when Adam was made, he didn't love God because there was no testimony of God's love, right? So he was made, God probably loved him as his creation and carrier of his image. So, and with Eve, we will see what it needs to be as a precondition of love, and that's the expectation. Adam noticed he didn't have a companion comparable to him, which made him desire one. And so that's a beautiful poem. First poem in the Bible is the one Adam gives to Eve, right? You're flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. And so I think that God is showing that for that condition of love, there needs to be a precondition, basically. And so I think that the fall of man gives that precondition for God to be able to come and show his testimony through language. And for me, language is we can't see it, and in language is not bound to the limitations of the concrete reality. And so I would say that language will represent more the spiritual, because it's the only way we can make visible what is invisible, right? My husband doesn't know I love him unless I say so, right? And so even when after the fall happened, you'll see how is the promise of God that gets in between Adam and the condemnation of separation. So it's the word for me that God has always used to save me. It's almost Jacob's ladder, right? You reach me because of my word and the testimony. And so, and every time the Spirit of God moves in the New Testament is after, and I have looked at it carefully and I haven't found any passage in which it hasn't, in which the testimony of the love of God and the Jesus sacrifice is to be told, is that the Spirit of God comes, right? It comes by hearing, and that salvation comes by hearing. Like we will be beast if it wasn't because of language, right?
Yes. This is a great perspective. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's great. This is what's so interesting about this material is that, as we talk about the medieval period, which, we'll be doing for a while now, we're going to find it's so rich and meaningful to each of us. And we bring so much to this material. We have so many interpretations that are meaningful to us personally. And part of the challenge of this book is to learn how to preserve our own interpretation while at the same time learning alternative interpretations that we can hold alongside it. And then we can look at the same material from multiple angles. So we can say, how does it look to me? But then we can say, but how do I think it looked to Hildegard von Bingen, say, a medieval, nun who was a visionary? Or we could say, how would it have looked to an ancient Greek philosopher who was being confronted with these arguments for the first time when Christianity was first arising? And they were having to think about, how do I choose between the Olympian polytheistic religion I was raised in versus these new ideas that are being presented to me? Part of what this book is trying to do is to get to where we can look at each of these things from multiple angles and see how varied the different interpretive frameworks are. It's interesting stuff. I mean, the point that you're making about the importance of language is right on the money. And it's central to this, right? I mean, one of the things that we've talked about for the last several years is this idea that the human mind, according to the existentialist tradition, has two great separate faculties in it. On the one hand, we're born like an infant with this powerful faculty of immersion. The infant feels everything intensely. Everything, when they're hungry, it's the hungriest anybody's ever been in the history of the world. And when they're happy, they're the happiest anybody's ever been in the history of the world. Everything is at 100%. There's no part of them that's separate from the moment of immersion. But over time, we gradually develop our second faculty, which is the separation, the ability to get out of the experience and to use language and logic and abstract thought to think ahead and think backwards and to communicate. Like you say, if we want to communicate to someone that we love them, we figure out how to encode that into language. And it's the same if we want to understand the behavior of light. Why does it split into colors through a prism? There's Newton. He's trying to figure out how to explain this thing that he's seeing, and so he's having to use language. He's having to really stretch the language to give voice to this faculty of the mind that has the ability to look beyond the immediate immersion in the moment and say, what's the bigger picture here? What is this moment a part of? What do I think is going to happen next? All of that. That's that second faculty. So the first faculty, a little bit of quick terminology, the immersive faculty is gnosis. That's the terminology that we're using. And noesis is the abstractive linguistic, kind of what we might call the rational faculty. And so we've got both of these faculties, and they each have their strengths and their weaknesses. And if it weren't for language, how would we ever give voice to all these things? The capacity for language is really built into that noetic side. And so this is an issue that I think I'm going to call on Stephen in just a second, but Stephen's talked about this before, the way that during the medieval era, the European church split in two. And we had the Western church centered in Rome, and we had the Eastern church centered in Constantinople. And the Western church spoke Latin, the Eastern church spoke Greek. They had some differences in theology, even though they were theoretically the same church. But one of the big differences was the Eastern church wanted to appeal not only to reason, but also to the immersive faculty in people. That's why the icons, all the beautiful artworks, they're trying, and ritual, and the use of scent, they're trying to draw you into the experience of being one with the body of Christ. Whereas in the Western church, there was a lot of suspicion about that. There was a lot of emphasis on reason and logic. As Jesuits are taught logic in seminary school. It's a centerpiece. It's a foundation of their theology. Is they envision a God who's a God strictly of reason, and he's the ultimate rational force in the cosmos. And so there's this tension throughout the medieval period between what is the nature of God, and is one of our faculties more important than the other faculty? Is one of them come from God and the other from the animals? Or did God give us both of them and they're both sacred? Is love as important as reason? I mean, these are the sorts of things they're wrestling about throughout this 1,000-year period, trying to understand God. And this is going to come up a lot, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, as we go through Kenneth Smith's text. He's going to talk about these issues you raised, Diana. It's great stuff. Thank you. So, Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was looking at this little passage here, and it seems to me that, well, there's a transition. It seems humanity, or whatever they are, were content with different sorts of gods that weren't all powerful. They were powerful, just not all powerful. There were all sorts of gods, and there were demons as well. And to feel safe, they had to worship the good gods to achieve favors from them. You also had to placate the mafia gods, the demons, to make sure they don't bother you. Because with this new God, everything was rolled up into one. He was the master of everything good and evil. You only have to appeal to the one God. It's, the all-stop shop for all your religious needs. But you look at this word, and it seems, there seems to be a problem here. It's the word rationalism, because this is part of a rationalization, part of a rational process. And okay, fair enough. You can say rationalism is a god, because we have all sorts of gods, as David Miller always tells me. We have gods like goodness and the truth and all these other gods. And so it's like people, when they talk, when they rationalize, they believe that the whole universe is going to behave according to their rationalization. The category they've created, their whole category net has become God. And the universe must obey their categories. I was just, I was in a meeting, and I read years ago, somebody was saying, oh, there was a particular German philosopher who said that the idea of survival is a bit misleading in the case of life. Life doesn't merely just wish to exist. Eventually, it wishes to expand. You could put life as an egg on your shelf, and it might sit there for ages doing nothing, and then one day it might do something. But modern thought dictates that that egg should sit on your shelf for eternity and fit in with your categories. Now, I was bringing up that issue that life always seeks to expand, and the other people in the meeting, they couldn't stand the idea. I was quite surprised when I'd read this 40, 50 years ago, 40 years ago. It's become so much part of my thinking that watch out, life always seeks more life. Life always wants to expand. And of course, liking Nietzsche, I noticed how well this thought pattern fitted in with Nietzsche. And they couldn't stand the idea. And I said, oh, I was saying, who came up with this idea? And I said, some German philosopher, in the late 19th century. And I was, talked down to on this issue. And eventually I looked it up in Copilot, and I just, asked the question. Eventually I asked the right question, and I didn't realize the philosopher had come up with this concept had been Big N himself. Big N, the man, the dude. They were having a meeting about Nietzsche, and they were sort of going down on me for expressing a concept which they didn't like, which was one of his concepts, a major one of his concepts. I suddenly realized when I checked it up on Copilot. But this trip people have got going, that the universe must operate as they think it should operate. It's so widespread now. I just see it everywhere. It's the ego. I have great plans for the universe and my part in it, and the universe better do as I tell it. Okay, yeah, I know it sounds funny, but there's a lot of people doing this stuff, and they've got big bombs.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I think the story of you confronting a Nietzsche group with a quote from Nietzsche, but you can't remember who said it, and they all dump on you, and then afterwards it turns out it's Nietzsche. I think that just sums things up nicely. They're telling you how much they love Nietzsche, but they only hate what he said, it turns out. His actual ideas they hate. They like the idea of him in some sort of abstract way. We see that a lot, right? I mean, this is going to be one of the struggles that we're going to see throughout 1,000 years of medieval history, is to what extent does the church hierarchy, which is trying to create a religious empire, like to hear from Jesus about how you should be poor, give away all your money, and instead of castigating prostitutes, maybe you should comfort them. Maybe you should comfort the poor, spend more time with the poor and the diseased, and how much do you end up with a hierarchy in the medieval epoch, especially by the end, that is insulating itself from pain and poverty, and clothing itself in cloth of gold and whatever it can manage to do, which is ultimately what leads to the downfall of the medieval epoch and the rise of the modern epoch. Is that great irony that the promise of the medieval epoch is that they found a way to end the corruption of ancient Rome by turning away from man and turning to God. And that struggle, to what extent are people willing to sacrifice for their idea? Or to what extent do they want to turn the idea into a little flag or a brand that they hold in front of them while they pick your pocket? You know, this is a major issue, you know,
A
across this
token,
1,000 years. Say that again?
token,
A token, a token.
a
Yes,
token of virtue.
yes,
It's like
yes.
the fig leaf, covering those little sins you don't want the world to see.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so, you know, your Nietzsche group says that they love Nietzsche. They just don't like the idea of Nietzsche's that you shared with them. You know, and if you'd remember, this is one of those, every language has something that it can say better than any other language. And French has that word that means the stairway conversation, which is as you're leaving the party where you had an argument and you couldn't think of the right thing to say as you're walking down the stairs away from the apartment, suddenly you remember what you should have said. Oh, it was that. You know, it's like, and then you look up online, and you're like, oh, if only I'd known at the time it was Nietzsche. I could have told these guys that the idea that they hate was from their idol. You know, so maybe they should look again. You know, this is the nature of things, of course. Uh, but yes, that issue of to what extent do we insist that reality conform to our plans and our ideologies versus to what extent are we willing to change our mind in the face of new evidence? To what extent are we willing to let the world teach us versus to what extent do we insist on trying to force the world to be what we expect
I
it to
know
be?
it hurts
Yeah,
when the universe doesn't do what I think it should do.
it
It
hurts, right?
hurts.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, thanks for sharing that, Stephen. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to address this issue between moving from suke to logos. And I'll try to work in the idea of the life expands to what it seems to me like, you know, once again, this is a second thought I had that was kind of very interesting. It came last night, actually. I was in another Heidegger meeting. We were talking about Heidegger. And the thing developed to like, it's really the force of the flow, the movement, that that's what being is about. And so I said, this is beginning to sound like Heraclitus, right? And I said, you know, because the river, you can never stand in the same river twice because the flow is always different, and it's a different river by the time you do it. And when I said that, I said, you know, but when I think about that quote, I begin to wonder, could you even step in the same river once? So that's interesting because yeah, I could see the flow. You can, and Josh, who's a very hardworking, I guess, thinker, kind of expanded on that. And essentially, what he said is that instance that you step in the water is already different. The reason is within the structure of being is not only identity, but difference. Because nature likes to cover itself over. There's always an invisible part of being, which is coming into being from the deep, which is hidden. And so therefore, there's always the being itself, the surface above the surface of the water, and the being that is in the process of surfacing and is exposing itself. So the problem with logic as we see it is that we have a one-track mind of being surfacing and going on in a single role, but in fact, within that movement of expanding life, there's difference. So the reason why we think of, you know, like a plant or a tree or something of that is that it grows upwards and there's a singular tree and the way it spreads itself, maybe it's got acorns or whatever. But there is another kind of life, which is like a rhizome, like a grass, that expands outwards, not only upwards, but outwards. Okay. And I learned this trick. I never did it myself. That if you take a tomato plant and you cut off the main stem and you sort of took the other stems and ground it and cover with a little dirt, it begins to become like a rhizome, and there are many, many plants that grows up. So the fact that the Western thinking has impinged on logos is a kind of singular movement, a very powerful movement moving on to something, is kind of like colonialism. But in fact, there's a difference, a diversity between the one and the many that in a sense expands, and we're trying to kill off the rhizomes in order to have the upward going trees in some sense. So therefore, in a sense, at the instant it is beneath the deep that is surfacing is also the rhizome. So every word itself, if you look at logos and if it maintain the suke part, that every logos what it has within it, the being that surface and the being that's hidden that is simultaneously surfacing on its own. So the relationship is that we have created a logic that includes the being and the nothingness. But the nothingness is the hidden part that's always surfacing in the relationship. So when you step in the river once, it's already blossoming in a diversity, because it's not like then you're going to step on the next one and the next one and the next one. It's like, yes, that's only a one-dimensional way of looking at being as the part that's already like, oh, it's already here. But beneath the surface, as we know, there's a three-dimensional part. The deep is
Yes.
what God is dealing with. And that's what logo is dealing with.
Yes.
But to keep it from becoming idle, you have to have that diversity that respects difference, not identity itself.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So in some sense, this is the difference between transforming from suke to logos, and you've got to have the logos retain the suke within it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it becomes a one-track mind. That's it. That's the second part. I thought that was very, very much worth saying without turning words and logic into a one-track mind that excludes difference. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, that issue of the sophistication and subtleness of the organization of the cosmos that we see the Greeks talking about relentlessly, right? Heraclitus says, nature loves to hide, physis cryptus tai phyle, and by which he means the logos, the order of nature of physis, is under the surface. We can see the leaf and we can see the tree, but we can't visibly see the forces of patterning and reproduction and the generations of trees over thousands of years. We don't live long enough. There are these deep patterns that are going on all the time around us. And the Greeks are very comfortable with that. When you said what you said, I immediately thought of Pando, the quaking aspen colony that goes on for miles. It's all one organism with a bunch of trees sticking up out of the system of rhizomes underneath the surface.
Well, my question becomes then, if you are a thinker with will, a thinker with consciousness, to what degree do you just deal with a surface that's already surfaced, and to what degree are you concerned with that which is potentially on the process of surfacing, the unconscious, if you want to call it that way? And
Yes.
therefore, in a sense, you have to think in a much more broad and expansive way. It's not just vertical, but it's also horizontal.
Yes. Yes. That's right. I mean, there's an opportunity not to be trapped by a system of logic in what you're saying. There's an opportunity to realize that there is a deeper logic to the cosmos that spreads out beyond our arguments, beyond our categories and our ideas, but there's something deeper going on. And there's plenty of evidence that that's the case.
That's how you avoid idol worship.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You learn to see that there's more going on. So this has kind of been our intro, and this is often the way our first hour or so is just kind of catching up with where we left off last time. So I'm gonna take us to the text. And last time we got most of the way through the first half of the opening paragraph, which I've already shared with everybody here. And this we got partway into the second, but there's some things I wanted to really call out in what Kenneth wrote in the second half that I want to talk about. Diana and Hakuna Matata, if you guys weren't here last week and you have questions about the first half of the paragraph, you know, just don't hesitate to ask. But otherwise, our focus is going to be the second half. You know, he starts with all creatures he made have specific instincts and motives driving their actions, but God alone is free in the ultimate sense. And then that is explained by the next sentence. His power is infinite, unbounded by any rival principle. And as we said last week, by principle, he doesn't mean the modern word principle. He's talking about the ancient Greek concept of an arche, a source of order. Unconfined by any inner nature of his own. And by nature, he's talking partly about ethos, character, the ancient Greek concept of the character in each person or each thing that makes it express what it is and determines what it wants and how it behaves. But of course, since this is a God who's said to create all of nature, at the same time he's talking about ethos, he's also talking about physis itself, nature itself. That nature doesn't constrain God, not an inner nature of his own, not any limitation of the hule, the matter that he's working with to create the cosmos. And so in this sense, he's establishing here that the medieval God is of a different kind than the ancient gods. He's not constrained by an outer nature, but also not constrained by an inner nature. The two infinities that all human beings live between, the infinity inside ourselves of our soul, our character on the one hand, which mysteriously guides and shapes our decisions and desires, what we notice and what we don't notice, and then the outward nature that brings us, tuche, fortune, all the things that, whereas if Joe were on the call, he'd say contingency, what happens because that's how it's going in the world, not because we will it. And we're saying here that God, the medieval God specifically, as God as the medievals conceive of him, is not like people at all in this regard. And he's not like Zeus at all, or any other ancient god. We may use the same word God to describe Zeus and the medieval God, but we really shouldn't, because the transformation in the nature of what it means to be divine that's being instituted by the medievals is so big a change that the result is unrecognizable compared to the gods that the Greeks worshipped. For Diana and Hakuna Matata's benefit, the simplest example is that the ancient Greeks believed that the gods did not create the world. The world created the gods. Poseidon didn't make the ocean. He doesn't control the ocean. He is the ocean. How can you disbelieve in Poseidon? Just put your foot in him. He's right there. And it was the same with Zeus and Hades and the rest. They're all expressions of parts of nature. And that's what they meant to the ancients. But with the medieval God, we've got a God who exists before nature, who created nature, who invented nature. He's not limited by nature. He's not just the voice of a hurricane or, the fire from a volcano's mouth, or he's in no way is he an attempt to explain or anthropomorphize some part of the world. And because he's not one of those things, he's basically not a god at all from the ancient perspective, because all ancient gods were like that. He's a new kind of idea, a new kind of thing in the world. And you better believe that the medievals, when they were arguing with the ancients and trying to convert them, they used this was the core of their argument. Your gods shouldn't even be called gods. Our God is on a completely different level from the kinds of things you've been worshiping before. This idea that there's no rock so big that God can't lift it, right? He can't. This is a fundamental change in nature. But what struck me when I was preparing for today's session is that it's not as fundamental a change as saying that he's also not limited by any inner nature of his own. This was the part of the sentence that I read past the previous times that I read this. I've maybe read this 2 or 3 times over the years. but I'm rereading it for these sessions. And this second clause of the sentence, unconfined by any inner nature of his own, that is just astonishing. Because the ancients believed that everything has an inner nature. Their gods do, people do, animals do, rocks do, rivers do, everything does. Their conception of the universe is not a bunch of things, it's a bunch of organisms. Even a pebble is an organism to the ancient Greeks. It may be a very stupid organism. It has no sensory organs whatsoever and no apparent desires, but at a chemical, material level, it has some willfulness. You press on it with your foot, and it's not inclined to bend to make your foot comfortable. It's inclined to keep its hardness and make you uncomfortable. You stub your toe on it. It's got a certain kind of limited chemical geological willfulness of its own. And the Greeks imagined that as it's a kind of organism. It has a kind of character of its own, a soul of its own, a very primitive soul to be sure, but a soul. And so the idea of a being who doesn't have an inner nature is as radical a revolution for the ancients as any other part of the medieval God. And it might be the most radical thing of all. Because the way the Greeks understand the world is everything, which to them is an organism, behaves according to its own inner nature. The nature of a pebble is different from the nature of a pebble-shaped piece of clay that I mold into with my hand. And I could even paint it to look like the most perfect replica of a pebble I can, but ultimately, if I push on one with my thumb, it stays hard, and if I push on the other, it goes soft because they have a different inner nature. You know what I mean? It is that nature that determines everything. That's the whole web of causality that comes from that's how they understand everything in the cosmos. But the medieval God doesn't have an inner nature in the sense that the ancients mean, because an inner nature is a limitation. It says what you can and can't do, what you can and can't notice, how you will or won't respond when you encounter things in the world. That's what the inner nature is. That's what his parenthetical means says. When he says unconfined by any inner nature of his own, parentheses, in the sense of a nature coordinated with and subject to the order of nature outside. This is that Greek idea that what you do in the world is the intersection between what your inner nature makes you want to do, but then does the world even give you the opportunity to do that thing or not? You're hungry, you're walking down the street and it's barren and all the shops are closed, you're going to be hungry. But if you're hungry and you're walking down the street and someone planted an apple tree and it's ripe, you can reach out and pick an apple. There's two completely different things happening with the same inner nature being affected by its interaction with the nature around it. What happens to be there versus what your agency wants you to do. And core to this idea of omnipotence and omniscience and omnipresence and being all good is this idea that the medieval God doesn't have those kinds of limits. And that means he can have something inside him, perhaps, but it's nothing like anything any ancient ever understood before. It's not an ethos in the way an ancient understands an ethos, because ethoses not only give you opportunities, they also give you limitations. And this medieval God can't have any limitations. Therefore, he can't have an ethos. This takes a little absorbing, because to us, it's a subtle point, but to the Greeks, it's the whole ballgame. Their entire framework of understanding is based on ethos. How are they supposed to understand someone who doesn't have an ethos? To them, that's almost incomprehensible. It's to absorb this medieval God as an idea would require the ancient Greeks to give up their entire frame of reference for everything. It's a radical revolution. I spent some time yesterday and this weekend kind of going back through chapter 4 and picking out key terms and working on my set of symbols to try to remember the ancient worldview, because as we're now going to be reading Aquinas and Hildegard von Bingen and all the other key medieval writers, it's going to be easy for me to lose track of this ancient perspective. But in this opening paragraph, this is what Kenneth is most concerned with, is a side-by-side, point-by-point comparison of the key essential elements of the medieval framework that are radically different from the ancient framework. So everything in this paragraph is more loaded than in any of the paragraphs to come. Because it may look like he's just saying things, but this is a dialogue with chapter 4. He's creating a dialogue between the medievals and the ancients here to say, how do they not understand each other? Well, because these ideas are so radically alien to each other. The second half of the I'll wait. Let's talk about this a little bit before I go on to the second half of the sentence. So Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, this is kind of an important question. It's a question. Because that really shines a different light on Christ. Because Christ was born as a God-man, okay, in some sense. And maybe he's maturing into a full-fledged God. But is Christ the missing link between the ancients and the medievals? Because he certainly has the character of a man with an inner nature, because when he was in the cross, he did say, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? I mean, like, that's a cry of pathos and perhaps desperation, right? So God needed Christ in one sense because it brings that inner nature to understanding mankind and maybe the world in a different way than just the pure idea that it was. But Christ was kind of a missing link to kind of throw some goodies to the ancients because, oh, this is kind of like your gods in some sense. So when did Christ become more godlike, or did it slowly emerge? Because when he was 12, he was already in temple turning over tables. Was it when he was baptized and the Holy Spirit penetrated him? Or was it when he ascended from the grave and that's when the Word became God? Because the Word was with God and the Word was God. And so it just seemed like a very, very interesting synthesis between Athens and Jerusalem. Because the missing link really is Christ in some sense. Like, even though Christ was, like Pontius Pilate. In fact, Pontius Pilate was hesitant enough that he didn't want to say anything. He just wanted to wash his hands. Because so that's kind of interesting, we're getting into dangerous territory. So in some sense, I'm going to stay clear of this. So yeah, that's kind of interesting that the link kind of a toss in just for your pagans is not that hard to relate to this other God because we have a missing link, a step to the abstract divine. Who the hell knows what that was? So that's interesting. I just want to ask that question, have you affirm and deny it or whatever, because it seems like it is absolutely necessary that he was there. Otherwise, it would even be harder just to hear him not even speak, but a burning bush. Is that's our God? All right. I mean, so okay. Just interjection, hoping you might say something more.
Sure. No, it's a great question. Judaism existed for quite some time, but we're not clear on, well, let me put it another way. We're very clear about how long Judaism was around according to Judaism. We're not very clear on how long Judaism was around in reality. Looking at the archaeological evidence, for example, recent archaeological discoveries show the Jewish people still being polytheistic up until the 1st century BCE. And according to the Torah, that's not true. The Torah says they were always monotheists, but occasionally they had falls from grace like the golden calf, and then they got chastised and went back to being monotheistic. But the archaeological evidence suggests that that's all false, that there were monotheist sects in Judaism, but they were minority sects, and that the majority of households prior to the 1st century BCE contained polytheistic shrines. They worshipped multiple gods. And that's sort of what you'd expect from a commandment that says you'll have no other gods before me. You can have a lot of gods, but I'm God number one, is what the commandment is literally saying. And you can do rhetorical tricks to try to ignore that fact, but the other thing is, we know from the Canaanite polytheistic pantheon that Yahweh was one of those deities. He was like the son of the Lord, who was the head of the pantheon. And that there may have been in historical times, I mean prehistoric times for us, but during the time in the Middle East, there may have been a period where there was an upset, a generational upset, and then Yahweh said, well, now I've overthrown my dad, now I want to be the top of the gods, and you should worship me first, ahead of the rest of the pantheon. And that's sort of captured. That moment is captured in the Old Testament. And there's other moments like that. There's references to casting down the pillars of Asherah. I may have the name wrong, come to think of it. But Yahweh used to have a consort back when he was part of a polytheistic religion. There was the male god, there was the female god, they were the sacred, couple. I don't even know if they had kids. I haven't looked at the Canaanite religion that closely, but that there came a stage where the priests of Yahweh didn't want to share the stage with his consort, and so they did a big campaign all over the Jewish homelands, going to all the temples and villages and knocking down the pillars that used to represent the goddess that was his companion. So that is also captured. There's actual references in the Old Testament to doing that. So what we see in the Old Testament, from a modern perspective or from a medieval perspective, we might want to read it as a document that was written for us, that this is one coherent statement about one coherent concept of God. But in Jewish culture, and I'll call you in just a second, Diana, Jewish culture recognizes that there are, for example, a series of covenants with God. There's a series of stages of the relationship of the Jewish people to God, and it changes over time. From one I can't say epoch, but from one era to another. And it depends on which book you're reading, kind of which set of rules apply and which concept of God that they have. This sort of thing is a little tough for us as readers, because we assume the Bible was written for us to tell us something clear and coherent, one picture of God, one God with one set of attributes. It's a little hard to take the book as it actually exists. So you can imagine, prior to the rise of Christianity, the religion really felt like the religion of the Jews specifically. It was their God. It was their history. It was the covenants that they had over time, and the passage of their people from one place to another, and so forth. And a Greek encountering that wouldn't feel especially compelled to adopt it. It's like, I'm from Athens. I'm not Jewish. I worship the ancient Greek pantheon. There's no particular reason why I would adopt the God of the Jews, because I'm not a Jew. The Christianity changes that picture. And we've this is something that's taught in church, is the struggle for whether Christianity is going to be a proselytizing religion that's open to the Gentiles, or whether it's going to be a closed religion that's just for the Jews. This is a struggle that's happening in the 1st century CE, after Jesus. And we talk about that. But one of the things that you raised, Phil, that we don't usually talk about is, what are the features of Christianity that make it more attractive to an ancient Greek? And one of them is that it's not just that they say, okay, our religion is for you too. It's not just for the Jews. I mean, there's that, sure. But there's also changes in the concept of God, the concept of the sacred. As you say, Jesus himself stands as kind of a link between this very alien God who exists before the universe, who the Greeks they can't understand. That doesn't make sense to them. Versus this one specific guy who is an incarnation of God and who suffered on the cross. And that's something they can relate to. That makes more sense to them. And his concept of what is the sacred, what is the divine, and how it works, again, is more appealing to the Greek peoples. It's in a sense that it translates better into their existing worldview and their existing value system. And so it offers not just the fact that the door is open to them, but that there's something in the room they might want to walk into in this theology, in this value system. That something in the room that it's obvious to them that they might want to walk into.
I wonder to what degree St. Paul put a bigger spin on Christ than on Yahweh. And I don't know. I mean, like, seems to me like that would be the selling point,
Yeah.
Christ, the manifest God versus God, the abstraction, the Yahweh. I don't know whether he put a little bit more spin. He's not going to exclude Yahweh, but
No,
seems
but
to
you
me
can
like
read
I would
the
be
epistles.
talking a
You're
lot
right.
about Christ. Yeah.
You're right, though. You can read the epistles, and if you look at the number of references to Jesus versus the number of references to Yahweh, man, he mentions Jesus all the time, but he only
Yeah.
occasionally mentions Yahweh.
Yeah.
He's shifted the focus, right?
Yeah.
So you make a good point, and we'll come back to that a lot in the years ahead. We'll spend a lot of time talking about these books and what they're talking about. But this core idea of the struggle that the Greeks have to understand the concept of a God who's before nature and not bound by nature, who can create ex nihilo, out of nothing, just out of his own spirit, out of his own will and his plan and his design. And that he not only is not bounded by the external nature of things, because there was nothing when he started, or maybe it was the waters, as you say, the spirit moving upon the waters. But at any rate, he's not constrained by the lawfulness of the matter that he's working with, if he's working with any matter and not just creating it. But more revolutionarily, he's not bound by his own inner ethos either. That from an ancient Greek perspective, he has no inner ethos. He may have something else, but it's not an ethos. If it were an ethos, it would limit him, and this is a God without limits. One of the things that I think about at moments like this is how, Kenneth Smith in Otherwise, and I think in Webb's, but especially Otherwise, he talks about how the Greeks did have the idea that, I'm going to come back to what you said, Stephen, a little bit. That's interesting. The Greeks did have the idea that their gods, the ancient Greek gods, were not people. And that right away, whenever you look at Hollywood depictions of, Zeus and Thor and all that, we always just say they're people we just say they're superheroes. Zeus is just this dude with a beard who throws thunderbolts and tantrums and sleeps around on Hera a lot. I mean, we depict them as people, but that's not an ancient Greek perspective at all. So the ancient Greeks said that they didn't have blood in their veins, had ichor, I-C-H-O-R, ichor, instead of blood. And they would have to, because we're mortal and they're not. The Titans, the Zeus and his siblings may have overthrown the Titans, the gods who were there before, but they couldn't do away with the Titans, because Titans, Olympians, all these deities, they're all immortal. And if they're immortal, that means they can't be like us, because we're mortal. And the Greeks believed we aren't mortal by accident. It's our ethos. It's our character to be mortal. Not just psychologically, but physically. Everything about us together conspires to make us mortal. All the way that they saw a lawful causal universe. They saw an architecture of Homo sapiens that was bound up with why we're mortal. And so therefore, if the gods were immortal, then their bodies must not be like our bodies, and they must not have blood in their veins. And so they named what they had, what the gods must have in their veins. They named it ichor to emphasize its alienness from what we have. They emphasized it further. They said they don't eat food and drink liquids. They eat ambrosia and they drink nectar, which are their words for the alternatives to food and drink. Because if they have a different kind of body with a different kind of substance in their veins, then they must have a different kind of thing that they ingest as well. And this was the way that they imagined it. So already before encountering the medieval deity, the concept of the medieval deity, the ancient Greeks had already had this idea that the sacred beings are of a radically different order than mortal beings. And so the idea that the medieval God might not have an ethos, although it's radical. I mean, because everything has an ethos. It's in some ways an extension of the idea that the Greeks already did have, which is that they didn't have blood and they didn't have food and they didn't have drink. Having accepted that and grown up with that, it was a, let's say, not an impossible step, but let's say a step over a very deep chasm to say, and this new God also doesn't have an ethos. There's nothing inside of him limits him. He's infinitely creative. He could do from one moment to the next, he could do anything. There's just no knowing what he might do, because he's gotten you can't learn his preferences and then say, well, Poseidon would never do that, or Ares would never do that. You can't say that about Yahweh, because with no ethos, you don't know what he would never do. He's got this inscrutability, this unknowability that's built, that is a direct result of making him able to do anything at any given moment. So all of this follows from what Kenneth Smith's saying here. This is kind of the point that he's emphasizing. It's kind of why I'm belaboring it a little bit. And this is what I mean for those who are new to these seminars, about how Kenneth Smith's writing has an incredible density to it. This issue of ethos, which is what he means by inner nature. You know, we know from chapter 4, he talked at length about ethos and character and inner nature. So we know that's what he means here. This idea that the medieval God has he can't have an inner nature in the way the Greeks understand it. He could have something else, but whatever it is, it doesn't limit him in any way. Everything else in the universe has limits from its own inner nature, but not this being. This is a different, radically different order of entity. He goes on to say, and this power is capable of any effect that is omnipotent. And of course, we know that, right? It's one of the first things anybody learns about the medieval God, or the God, you know, that as we conceive of him today, is that he's omnipotent. He could do anything at any given time. The self-sufficiency and self-rule that Greek aristocracy took as the highest state for exceptional humans to strive for. Of course, self-rule, that's autarkia, right? We've talked about autarkia. You put that in there. Self-rule and self-sufficiency is a trickier one to get an exact term for. We might say autonomia, like autonomous. But autonomia more means that, you know, you're deciding what you're going to do. But anyway, to finish this bit, that Greek aristocracy took as the highest state for exceptional humans to strive for. Okay, now this is emphasizing the political structure, right? Where he's now turned from the ontological challenge of imagining a being without ethos, and he's turning to politics. And in the ancient Greek world, the idea is that, you know, different people have a different ethos, and some people have an ethos that wills them to be all appetites and desires, and those people shouldn't be allowed in government according to the ancient concept of government. And other people, they're ruled by calculation and ideology. They're always thinking about how to screw over their fellow man for a percentage. You know, in the marketplace, the Greeks are skeptical about the moral quality of people who engage in trade. And so they're saying those people shouldn't govern either. The only people who should govern are people whose character allows them to see the reality and importance of other people and the world at large. The only people who should rule are people who can think about more than themselves. People who can think about, how do you cultivate human beings to be the best versions of themselves so that their gifts can flower for society. You don't want to make everybody conform and stamp out their gifts in a desire to make everybody the same kind of person, because then you're going to lose your Mozarts and your Einsteins, right? And you may need your Mozarts and your Einsteins. You don't know. You know, the reality is, the Greeks said, the reality is you don't know what the future holds. You don't know what the challenge is going to be. You don't know what the gifts are going to be that you need to survive as a people. And so what you need to do is be searching your children for what seeds of greatness lie within them, no matter which crazy direction that greatness may express itself. I mean, maybe somebody's going to be a good doctor. Maybe somebody else is really good at playing the lyre. I mean, you don't know what the thing is, but whatever it is, cultivate it. encourage them, give them the what they need to let that thing flower, so that if that turns out to be the thing that you need, then your culture will have it. You won't have stamped it out in a desire to force everybody to be the same. And this caused them to have some uncomfortable relationships with their own slave societies. Because they're like, are those people slaves because of their character, which is what the Greeks thought it should be? Or are those people slaves because somebody kidnapped their parents and sold them into slavery? And maybe that person actually has great gifts of insight that we need in government, but you've got him hauling mud. And if you're doing that, then it's not just a crime against him, but it's a crime against all of society, because our survival may depend on that guy's rhetorical gifts, which you're stamping out by making him haul mud. And likewise, you might have in your government somebody who claims to be interested in the good of all, but he's actually a con man. He's just really good at rhetoric. And that person is a threat to our survival. They should not be in government at all if all they can think about is how to line their own pockets and fool people. You gotta be scrutinizing your society and always thinking about how do you rearrange where people are in the society so that the level of responsibility and power that they're given is commensurate with their gifts and their vices. It's a challenge to make all this match up. And the Greeks had enormous trouble with this. And by the Roman era, they're not even pretending to do it anymore. And that's what leads to the dissatisfaction. The corruption in Rome is what ultimately leads to the overthrow and the rise of the medieval epoch. So self-sufficiency and self-rule are among the qualities that they're looking for in people who ought to be governing, according to the Greeks. That's what he's referring to here. And he says, exemplified not just by the Olympians, but also by every animal's instinctual self-conduct. I'm going to come back to that. He's talking about sophrosune. But let's finish this sentence first. He says, has become an exclusive prerogative of this God alone, who possesses it in the superlative degree. Only the medieval God is fully self-sufficient and self-ruling because he's moved the goalposts. For everybody else, self-sufficiency and self-rule are only relative, right? Because you don't know your own character completely. You can never be fully in charge of yourself. You could try and you can struggle. And if you try and you admit that you've got issues, that you're freight that you're taking with you into each situation and that you're responsible for, that's a whole lot better than the people who just kind of overconfidently charge into life claiming that they know themselves when they don't. And so the Greeks are thinking that, self-sufficiency and self-rule are this relative thing. But along comes this God who's defined in a way that he's got an infinite amount of it. He's not limited by the world outside himself. He's not limited by the world inside himself. He doesn't need anybody or anything. And with that definition, suddenly even the best and the brightest that the ancient Greeks have to offer start to look like pathetic slaves by comparison. In fact, even their gods start to look like pathetic slaves by comparison. I mean, Zeus doesn't have infinite self-sufficiency or self-rule, and he's the king of the gods. This new god is like he's redefined everything so that everybody else looks like losers. It really throws into disarray the whole concept of the framework of ancient Greek society and governance. And not just ancient Greek, the whole ancient world. The whole basis is based on character. There's this thing that happens in math when you're dealing with infinity and zero, where you can wreck your math equation. So like, if you're doing an arithmetic problem and you say, okay, 1 + 1 is 2, 1 + 2 is 3, 1 + 3 is 4, so far so good. But if you try saying, what's 1 + infinity, there it doesn't have an answer. It's like infinity is so big that it makes 1 a non-entity that has effectively no value at all by comparison. And you see that when you do things like, say, what if I divide 4 by 4? I get 1. What if I divide 4 by 2? I get 2. What if I divide 4 by 1? I get 4. The smaller the number in the denominator, the larger the answer that comes out. So what if you divide by 0, which is the smallest value we have? Well, you know how math solves this problem? They say, don't do that. Literally, the rules of mathematics are you should never write any number divided by 0. Just ban that, because the answer is unmanageable. It's effectively some kind of infinity, but what kind of infinity is not defined, not determined. This is basic arithmetic, and they're having to put in a stop sign saying, don't go this way. It's a broken piece of math. When you mess with zeros in the wrong places or infinities in the wrong places, it wrecks your ability to do mathematics. Because they destroy the relative, your ability to compare one number to another. Zero's too small in certain contexts, like division, and infinity's too big in other contexts. So what happens when you have a whole ancient society that's based upon carefully scrutinizing people's relative character and value, their gifts, what they can and can't do, and then along comes Mr. Infinity here, who's infinitely good and doesn't need anything. He has no limits. It wrecks everything. The entire framework for decision making, for politics, the economy, and everything else, it completely collapses. I had a humanities teacher who once pointed out to me that when the Greeks built temples, even though they used geometry, you can see the straight lines and you can see the triangles, you can see the intensely geometric quality of the architecture of these classical temples. What they did not do is make the pillars go straight up. He said the Greeks detested infinity because infinity wrecked things. They were aware of infinity, they just didn't like it. So they wouldn't make the pillars go straight up, they'd tilt them in every so slightly, so that if you extended them upwards, it would make a very tall, skinny triangle. But at some point, they would come together and it would stop. It wouldn't be infinite. Because that's how much the Greeks didn't like infinity. So along comes an infinite God. He can do anything at any time for any reason. There's no knowing what he'll do. He has no inner ethos that you can limit him or predict him based on. So what are you supposed to do? And I think mostly what the Greeks did initially was panic. Well, we'll come back to this over the weeks and months ahead, but they were way out of their depths here. They were not comfortable. So Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, then there's no sophrosyne, no self-providence, because that's aligning your behavior with your internal character, your arche. So, yeah, we've got a rogue God running around the world. We'd better catch that God and put some limits on him quick, huh?
Yes, yes. You have put your finger on the central issue, the thing I skated past, that thing between the dashes at the end of paragraph 1. Let me just put that back into the chat here, right? So what are we talking about here? We're talking about autarkia. We're talking about self-sufficiency, self-rule, this thing that's taken as the highest state for exceptional human beings to strive for. For the last couple of months, before we wrapped up the discussion of the ancient world, we focused on this issue of sophrosyne, right? This is the most important word in the ancient Greek language. It's their highest value. Aristotle's relentless talking about sophrosyne, and the components of sophrosyne, which are sophron and phronesis. You can find references to sophron and phronesis all over the place in ancient Greek writings, even when they don't explicitly mention sophrosyne. To them, this is what everything's about. This is the whole ball game. And we'll do a little capsule version of it now, because it underscores, like Donald's saying, the catastrophe to the ancient Greek worldview that the medieval concept of God represents. So sophrosyne is based on the idea that, and this idea is an observation, that when you look at animals and plants and fungi, when you look at every living thing that you can imagine, weirdly, they all seem to know what they're doing in some sort of way. I mean, they don't have theories or language or any of the things we assume. They don't write treatises declaring their no manifestos, right? They don't do any of those things. But the cheetah seems to know what it's doing out there on the plains. It knows when it's time to take a bath and get clean so it doesn't smell like the blood of the animal that it just ate. It knows when it's time to go potty somewhere out of the way where other people won't know what it's up to. It knows when it's thirsty. It knows to sleep somewhere where the hyenas won't bother it. And it knows when it's time to be fastened by the gazelle. Can't take its eyes off the gazelle. Follows the gazelle around. Oh, it's so pretty. The gazelle is so pretty. And we talked about before, you could put a web browser to a porn site in front of the cheetah and it would pay no attention. You could put a stack of copies of Mein Kampf next to the cheetah and it's not interested. You could give it the red button to push the nuclear bombs and cause the end of the world, and it's not interested. You could put stacks of money and it doesn't care. It doesn't care about any of these things people care about. But boy, does it care about the gazelle. And it should, because the way of life of a cheetah depends upon being fascinated by its prey animals. They're so pretty to the cheetah, it can't stop thinking about them, except when it's time for a bath, except when it's time to sleep, except when it's time to do something else that's part of the cheetah life. The Greeks called this sophrosune. They said the cheetah has a compass in its head that points at some small list of things that at that moment, any one of them would be the right thing for the cheetah to do. And that compass points so strongly that the cheetah is not distracted by all these things that distract human beings. Human beings seem weirdly lost by comparison. I mean, we could be obsessed with old jazz songs of the 40s. We could be obsessed with old Star Trek episodes. We could be obsessed with a new website where you can buy things at a low price. You know, I mean, we could be obsessed with the new white wall tires of the latest Cadillac. There's no telling what people are going to be obsessed with from one moment to the next. And that's utterly different from a cheetah. It's different from a cheetah. It's different from a salmon. It's different from a peregrine falcon. It's different from an oak tree. All these other things seem to have their shit together. Pardon my French. I'm trying to remember who it is that said, it wasn't Eugene O'Neill, George Bernard Shaw. No man manages his life out after the first 9 months in the womb half as well as a tree does. And the tree manages its life pretty well. You know, it puts out its leaves when it should, it drops them when it should, it flowers when it should, it bears fruit when it should, it spreads its roots, you know, finds where's a good place to hang onto the ground. It's like there's lots of things a tree has to do, even though it doesn't walk around in a slow motion, growing vegetative way. There's a lot of work a tree has to do to succeed. And the amazing thing about trees is that most of the time, they mostly do those things. You don't ever see a tree forgetting to put out leaves because it was watching a marathon of some new TV show. I mean, it doesn't get distracted from the things that matter for the tree's survival. Sophrosune, it has the compass. It doesn't even have a head, but it's got the compass built into it that points at, look, there's a little extra light there. I should put a leaf that direction, right? I mean, it's like it's sensing its condition in the world and its needs, and it's balancing them with a level of finesse that's frankly enviable. I mean, you look at people, I mean, my God. You know, when Phil was talking about stepping in the same river twice earlier on this call, what I was thinking about is how, and he was talking about below the surface, the deep interconnections that spread out laterally. I was thinking about how here in the Pacific Northwest where I live, you know, I live in Seattle, all the rivers that run to the sea used to be salmon runs. Many of them still are. This is some people call it Salmon Nation. This whole stretch of coast is it's just every river has its salmon that are native to that specific river, not any other river. They were born in that river. They swam downstream. They swam into the ocean. They live in the ocean for God knows how many years, traveling all over the place, having all kinds of little salmon adventures. And then somehow, when the time is right, they just want to go home. And they remember the smell of their river that's different from every other river. We've got countless tiny rivers flowing out of the mountains, but they remember the smell of their river, different from every other river. And it doesn't matter how far they went in the Pacific Ocean, they turn around and they swim back to that one mouth and they swim back up that one river to reproduce. I can barely remember my age from one day to the next. I mean, how the hell do these salmon, they remember with this huge level of specificity after having a whole lifetime of adventures and being as far from home as possible? They still remember the way home. And they only traveled that road once before in their lives when they were so young. How could they remember anything? But they get it right. We really don't have any records ever of a salmon getting it wrong and swimming up the wrong river. I mean, people have been tagging salmon and trying all kinds of things to learn how salmon work, and we've never once spotted one making them. They might not make it. A bear might eat them. Okay, that's not their fault. But when they're in control of the game, they always, with 100% accuracy, go back to the right place. And somehow they go at the right time. How do they know that? Because they go back when all the other salmon from their same generation also go back. It's not just they remember the place, they remember the time somehow. They got a little clock in their heads along with that compass. It's amazing. I mean, birds migrating, salmon migrating, cheetah chasing the gazelle, trees knowing how to grow, even a slime mold or an amoeba, the way it pursues bacteria, and or they've used that to have amoebas solve mazes. Amoeba it doesn't have a brain in its head. It doesn't have a head. It doesn't have a neuron. It's just a single cell. It can still solve a maze. There is a level of intelligence and orientation that all of these living things have that human beings lack. And the Greeks thought this is the most important thing in the world. They called it sophrosune. It's knowing what would be a healthy lifestyle for you. What is a healthy way of life? And if that's a healthy way of life, then what are the things you should notice and care about and become good at in order to be good at living that kind of healthy life? Every other living being has sophrosune, but people don't. We don't have sophrosune. And they have a whole framework about why that is. Aristotle's whole books, especially Nicomachean Ethics, but all of his books about ethics are all talking about this issue of how can human beings simulate sophrosune? How can we use education and culture to try to emulate the animals, to do like they do, and come up with some substitute for sophrosune? It's the most important thing in the world to them, but it's all based on the idea. And this is where we go to what Donald said. Sorry, Donald, you said it succinctly, and now I'm saying it a long-winded, this is my usual, problem, right? Sprawling, long-winded, lots of examples way. The key to sophrosune is that we're mortals, and we have certain needs that have to be met, and if we don't meet those needs, we die. So we have to know what our needs are. And knowing what those needs are is then the basis for sophrosune, to say, well, what kind of a life would let us meet those needs? And what sort of things should we learn to get good at? What arete should we cultivate in ourselves? So we need to be fast runners? Do we need to be great at tying knots? Do we need to be amazing singers? Do we need to become literate and learn how to read and write? What is the thing that's going to make our way of life work that we have to become excellent at in order to succeed? All of this whole framework of life with multiple layers of decision making is based on the idea that we are mortal and we have needs. Even the immortal gods of Olympus have sophrosune. All the ancient deities have sophrosune because none of them is bigger than nature. They're all just parts of nature. They express aspects of nature, but not the medieval god. The medieval god came before nature. He's bigger than the cosmos. He existed outside the cosmos. He made it from scratch because he felt like it, or for whatever reason he had, which we can't know. We can't learn his ethos because an ethos would limit him. And he doesn't have limits, so he doesn't have an ethos. If he doesn't have an ethos and he doesn't have needs and he's 100% self-sufficient, then he can't have sophrosune. Because sophrosune is the thing that finite beings use to meet their needs. It's the compass that points in the right direction. But a being who's infinite, all-powerful, and doesn't need anything, doesn't need sophrosune either. He doesn't have a problem to solve. Sophrosune is there to solve a problem. He doesn't have that problem. And this is probably, Donald's right, this is probably the element of the god that is the most alien to the ancients. A cosmos in which sophrosune doesn't matter is a cosmos that doesn't make sense to an ancient. That's incomprehensible. It's like trying to have a conversation with, let's say, Augustine, who wrote City of God, in which you postulate a God without any heaven or hell. There's no need for salvation. There's no possibility of damnation. Now let's talk about God. And Augustine's like, you're making no sense. You're saying blah, blah, blah. Salvation and damnation are everything. This is the whole framework of the cosmos. You can't say, what if the cosmos doesn't have salvation and damnation? It's incomprehensible. To the medieval mind, those things have to be there. Likewise, to the ancient mind, sophrosune has to be there. The cosmos makes no sense at all without sophrosune. It's the whole ballgame. So this opening paragraph to chapter 5, Kenneth Smith is laying out for us, if we have read chapter 4, We spent 2 years reading chapter 4. If we have read chapter 4 and deconstructed the whole picture of what it means to be an ancient and what matters to them, then this opening paragraph makes clear what a slap in the face the medieval worldview is to the ancients. It's like it literally overthrows everything they care about. And it overthrows it so deeply that the result is a world that makes no sense to the ancients. This is an unworld. Beings without an ethos, a world in which Sofrosuni doesn't matter. What the hell? A universe in which at any moment anything might happen because God, it's not causality. It's not the ethos of all the natural things that's making the world unfold the way it does, the way the ancients imagined it. Now, the only thing that matters is the will of God. And what he wills from one instant to the next determines what happens. And at any time, he can will anything he wants to. Gravity could go the other direction at any moment, if that's what God wants. You just fly off the earth. That's the kind of God that we're talking about here. And the ancients are not prepared for a world that doesn't have the causal web to reassure them that things are going to happen in a predictable way. This is a shocking idea. So, Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Interesting idea, I must say. I'm trying to relate. I mean, that seems like the relationship between the finite and the infinite, and there seems to be something in between, okay? Because it seems like animals have a kind of short shopping list. There's maybe 3 items. You go to a grocery store, you got 3 items, you know, you know what to choose. Either item 1, yeah, I'll take door number 2. That seems easy. It seems like the problem with human beings is that we have a very long shopping list. It's not infinite, but very long, okay? And that we do not have a big enough consciousness to even deal with this long shopping list, even though it's not infinite. Thank God it isn't that, at least. And so, therefore, in a sense, we need this sort of self-providence, in a sense, guide us in certain ways. And certain people obviously seem to lack a certain something. So I'm wondering, like, how did that come about? Because God at some point gave a special gift to humanity. I mean, we take the Judeo Christian point of view. He gave him free will. Okay. I gave you a long shopping list. That their long shopping list came from the free will. Like suddenly, wow, like I'm approaching. It's not infinity, but I'm approaching infinity. Did he give it to him before or after he ate the apple? Right? Because he ate the apple and suddenly you acquire this surplus, what we call knowledge. You seem to understand certain things. You understand you're naked, for instance. That's not good. And so was that when he did it? And did he not give it to him, or did he just like entice them with the tree and in fact kind of warn them, don't eat this one? And you know how kids are. You say, don't do this, they're going to do it right away. And so is that when, or did he all along gave them free will and then they suddenly discovered the apple tree and now they have this shopping list they got, and God got angry because now you don't live in this peaceful world. Well, it's not actually peaceful because lions do still eat gazelles, even in heaven. So, in some sense, you're an alien and you're thrown away. I guess. So that seems like, so once you're thrown out. I mean, assuming the myth of the Judeo-Christian thing is correct, you're thrown out. Then no wonder you need somebody to, in a sense, constrain your shopping list. When you're young, your parents says, now just make sure you buy you some coffee and some nuts and some this, there's that. And it's not a long list. And you come home, of course, you got some extra candy bar, your mom's gonna get very angry and yell at you. So that's not on the list. So in some sense, you have to then have institution in a sense constrain that. But those institutions seem to somehow contradict uh, this sort of self-providence because, and when you grow up to be a teenager, like, Mom, like, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm interested in buying candy bars, whatever. So you rebel. I mean, how does that tension exist that on the one hand, you need a certain kind of cutting down of the shopping list, and to a certain degree, yeah, you also want to because you have, Mom, I have free will. I mean, and so, I mean, that seems to be trouble because once you got free will, you could freely, I suppose, do what is good, but you can also do freely what is bad because there's no distinction between good and bad. You just want to do what's, quote, right for you. And so in some sense, that's going to release a torrent of undesirable, what I call, Sergio Leone's movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The good and the bad now is fighting it out, and that's how things get ugly. Without the shopping list that Mom gave you, and you disobey, and some will do good and some will do bad, and it's all gone to hell.
Yep.
Sergio Leone is pretty damn good at naming his movies. So I think that's where we are, because we have thrown away the book of God that gave us order. He used to say, don't do these kind of things, you can go to hell.
Yes.
And you're very careful. But now we don't have that, but we still have the will.
Yes.
He ate the apple, and we could blame it on that's sort of like entrapment, God, you put the damn apple tree right there, and lure us into it, it's not our fault, So I guess that I think that is a kind of entrapment. So that's kind of sneaky of God to do that too, So to make sure that you eat it and you get a taste of the punishment that's going to come. All right, I mean, it just seems like a real funny problem that given free will, we will do what we do, and we it's our destiny. But on the other hand, and free will needs a certain amount of constraint. Otherwise, you will get the wrong shopping list.
Yeah.
What I say. So even though that's not infinite, that's a very expanded universe beyond our capacity to handle. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, you bring us back off into the Garden of Eden, and it's forced me to think about it at a deeper level than I used to, and I appreciate that. I wonder sometimes now if the story of the tree and the fruit, which I had always internalized as from the medieval perspective of, women were bad and they tempted men, and that's why men rule women, and all this medieval patriarchal framework, comes out of that. The sin of Eve is why the pain and the suffering of birth. But I wonder if that was maybe not at all what the Jews had in mind. I wonder if what they had in mind is an explanation for how come all the other animals have sophrosyne and we don't? Why are we so confused? Well, because we see so many more choices than they see. We ate of the apple, and now all kinds of choices are available to us, good choices and bad choices alike. And it's confusing. The cheetah has, as you say, a smaller shopping list. It's not as hard for the cheetah to figure out what's the right thing to do because the shopping list is smaller.
Well,
And
apparently an apple tree wasn't in any of the shopping lists.
I know, right? But our shopping list is now gigantic, and it's easy to get lost in it. Yeah, I'm gonna be thinking about that, and I owe it to you, Phil. So thank you for that. Okay, we got a couple people waiting. We got James and then Diana. So I'm gonna call on James, and then I'll call on you, Diana. So James, what's on your mind?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So would you say that the medieval worship of this transcendent God is one way of extreme way of maybe a reaction against our free nature? we have so you know, a large shopping list, but we need to you know, be more selective. But the medieval God is a way of limiting our desires. At the same time, it's also denying us the self-esteem that we should have. So you worship something that's beyond your body, your flesh, and that's more important than your own body. And so it seems like Nietzsche's genealogy was a way to return us back to our natural bodies, where we find, where he thought we find our self-esteem, right? Our bodies tell us, you know, what we need, and if we listen to our bodies, you know, we could, you know, we discover that we have this, you know, energy and power to rediscover our self-esteem, perhaps. And so is Nietzsche's Overman kind of like the Aristotelian? Because the Overman is Nietzsche saw, you know, saw this aristocracy in the Overman, who was able to recognize what is good, right, and be able to develop an ethics of what he believed was good, rather than being enslaved by the herd mentality of you know, the Nosoi and the Dulois, you know, diversity of desires and or limitations of what the, you know, of their own powers.
Yes.
By being enslaved to these, you know, errant desires of this, you know, that's you know, divorced from what self-esteem is. You know, they forget they're really, you know, they're misusing their powers and forgetting their real needs. You know, so
Yeah.
also, do you think that you know, there's philosophers who are trying to define what being is, or trying to find the ethics, you know, by way of discovering their being? Is that what they're looking for? You know, it seems like, because here, you know, Nietzsche and Heidegger is going back to the pre-Socratics, right? And they're
Right.
saying they knew the truth, and they knew what being was. You know, being is not just a transcendent notion of being, but it's also closer to a more existential, closer to the earth, the realization of our bodies and our flesh as being what our true beings are. And a true being is within this world, within the finite world, rather than some infinite, you know, God outside of us.
Well, you just covered about 3,000 years of philosophical history there with your question. But it was not random. It was a good thread. So this is you were asking ultimately about Sofrosune and the role that you know, what does the medieval framework do to Sofrosune, and what do Nietzsche and Heidegger and others do in reaction to that? So let's trace it just a little bit, because it's a very interesting question. Ultimately, the promise of the ancient epoch, and this is one of the things for Diana's benefit, you know, we're using an existentialist view of history, in which these epochs in history, they're not just like lines on a date chart saying it starts here and it ends here. It's nothing like that. We're saying that an epoch is a period of history that, like the ancients believed, acts like an organism. It holds itself together. And when people try to rebel against the dominant ideas of an epoch, as long as they're still in the strong part of the epoch, even the rebellion ends up circling back and reinforcing the epoch and keeping it going. And our classic example is Lenin wanted more than anything to put an end to capitalism in Russia. But look at Russia today. It's the direct consequence of what he set in motion. His act of rebellion actually strengthened capitalism in Russia eventually. And that paradox, that this isn't me being smarmy and going, haha, Lenin. This is an illustration of the power of an epoch, is that he rebelled against the parts of the modern world that he was aware of, but the other parts of the modern ideology that he was not aware of, he couldn't rebel against. So he carried those intact into the new society that he created. And thus, the revolutionary Russia was not a complete break from the modern world. It still had a lot in common with capitalism, so much in common that moving back to capitalism later was an easy step. But he couldn't see that because he didn't understand the nature of the society that he was inside of, the epoch. And none of us do. This is the water we swim in. Our epoch dominates our thinking at a really low unconscious level. So if we go back and look at the ancient world, we see that each of these epochs starts with a promise. It starts as a rebellion against the epoch that existed before, that says, here's why we have to leave the old epoch. Here's what's wrong with the old order. It's not tolerable anymore. No one wants the old way anymore. The old way is killing us. It's just we're living cramped, miserable lives, and we can't stand it anymore. So we're gonna move out of this epoch. We're gonna create something bold and new. This is what we know that this is the case because we can see the beginnings of the medieval epoch and we can see the beginnings of the modern epoch. We can't see the beginning of the ancient epoch. We're not sure exactly when it started, and we don't know for sure what was there before. Archaeology has only come along so far. We know there were epochs before that, but we don't know very much about what they were like. They didn't have writing through a lot of it, for one thing, in a lot of places. So they didn't tell us what they had on their mind. So we have the end of the ancient epoch, but not the beginning. And the modern epoch, we have the beginning, but not the end. I mean, a lot of people think we're in the late stages, but we still haven't actually arrived at the end of this epoch. So we don't know how it's going to end or why, and we don't know what's going to replace it. The only epoch we can see from beginning to end is the medieval epoch. We know how it arose as a rebellion against the ancient epoch, and we know how it was ended with the rise of modernity, which was frustrated with its corruption, which is ironic because the medieval epoch began with frustration over the corruption of Rome. The ancient Roman Empire had grown so corrupt. There came a point where it was so corrupt, everyone was so frustrated with it, that eventually when the barbarians invaded, instead of everybody unifying to fight off the barbarians, which as they'd done in the past, they eventually said, how bad could it be? It can't be as bad as our current Roman governors. Come on in, barbarians. Sure, whatever. I mean, it'll suck, but it won't suck as much as paying taxes to the emperor, which sucks so bad. It's like there comes a point where people don't want to fight for the existing way anymore, and that was part of what was involved in the collapse of the ancient worldview. So the medieval worldview was basically saying the rise in its beginning. It was saying that the promise of the ancient epoch was broken. They promised that by having worthy people of good character in charge, then the human world would have good governance. This is the promise of the ancient world. It says each being is governed by their character, by their ethos. So what we'll do is we'll keep people of bad character out of government. We'll limit to them to the sorts of things you can trust them to do. And the only people who will be allowed to govern are people of good character. On the surface, it sounds like a reasonable idea. But by the time you get to the late stage Roman Empire, it's patently obvious the people in charge have the worst character. They're just predators and con artists. And they said, you said this wouldn't happen. You said that good people of good character would be in charge. And instead we get this rot. So we don't believe you anymore. We don't trust you anymore. We got to look for answers somewhere else. And hey, look at this Jesus guy. I think he's got some answers. We're going to give that a shot because we don't trust you anymore. This is how the medieval epoch gets started, is with this sense of betrayal and frustration and the desire to find a way that's not so rotten and corrupt. So, going to James's question, where this is relevant is this issue of the belief was that through culturing people to have the best possible character, and then through discriminating who has the best character among us, we can figure out who ought to govern. And the people who ought to govern are the ones who have sophrosune, who have cultivated an equivalent to sophrosune. We're not born with it, but maybe with the right education, the right upbringing, and the right other features, maybe you can get people who can think about what's good for society. And those are the people who should govern. That's the ancient idea. But the medieval idea says, okay, it sounded like a good idea, but it obviously didn't work because look what we got stuck with. I mean, this is the whole focus of Augustine's City of God. That book he wrote is all about contrasting it with the City of Man, which is the corrupt Rome of the Roman Empire. And he's saying, look, that's just not working. I mean, look how bad it is. We need something else. We need something better. He says, I got it. God is incorruptible. He's all knowing. He's all powerful. He's all good. He's ubiquitous. He doesn't miss anything. He sees everything that's happening. He knows where we should go. He can be our sophrosune. If we'll just listen to God, then we can make up for the fact that evidently people's character is just too fallible to be trusted. As Rome has demonstrated, we can't trust them. The empire is just, it's a mess. But God's not a mess. God knows what we should be doing. So we should listen to God. God will be our substitute for our missing sophrosune. And that's the promise of the medieval epoch. That's the whole framework in a nutshell. If we just listen to God and obey God, he can supply the missing sophrosune, and we can make a just world in which people are kind to each other and loving and wise and, you know, as responsible as we can be and so forth. So James's question then jumps us ahead past the end of the medieval epoch to people like Nietzsche, who are responding to, you know, how the medieval epoch ended, which was it ended in corruption again, which was incomprehensible. How can that, from the medieval framework, it's incomprehensible that the medieval epoch could end in corruption. Because if you put your faith in God and God is incorruptible and tells you what to do, how on earth can you end up with the papacy in the late medieval period buying and selling indulgences, the Pope getting secretly married and having kids and getting his kids appointed to positions of power? There's all this rotten stuff going on with the Borgia popes and stuff around that period where the medieval epoch was coming to an end. Getting involved in wars, I mean, all kinds of stuff they were doing that they were supposed to not do. How could that happen? And, you know, we'll get to that when we get to the modern epoch and its critique of what went wrong in the medieval order. But I think, James, you're right on the money when you say that, you know, what Nietzsche is trying to do is say, okay, that didn't work either. So what would work? And I think he's trying to say we threw out the baby with the bathwater when we threw out the ancient worldview. And maybe it wasn't perfect, but there's parts of it that are better than what we had later. And this idea that we need to be in touch with, you know, our inner character. What are we driven to do? What do we long to do? What's in us that's trying to express itself? I think Nietzsche's saying you can't be a moral person if you just suppress that and you have no idea who you are inside. Because then you're constantly going to be disappointing and surprising yourself. And you're also going to be living a half unfulfilled life. Like if you're desperately hungry, but you refuse to eat for ideological reasons, you just get weaker and weaker until you die. And this is Nietzsche's metaphor for what it means to kill the inner spirit that your body is trying to share with you, because for ideological reasons, you've been told you shouldn't listen to your body. Now, I don't think that Nietzsche ever felt he fully had the answers. You know, this is a guy who was not a systematic philosopher. He was having arguments with himself from one book to the next. What did I say before that I don't agree with anymore? And so you sort of have to read his books that way. But his stuff about the Übermensch is certainly postulating the idea that lowest common denominator approaches to education and governance don't work. We can't just say, let's all treat everybody the same, because then you're treating Mother Teresa the same way as Jeffrey Dahmer. You're treating Martin Luther King Jr., you know, the same way as the guy behind the Jonestown Massacre. It's not just. You have to distinguish people according to their character. You have to. Some people can be trusted more than others. Some people can't be trusted as far as you can throw them. And if you say these people are the same, then next thing you know, you're going to have pedophiles as babysitters, and you know you're going to have con artists as presidents. You can't do this. You have to make these distinctions. And so his Übermensch is he's imagining, what if we evolved further and there is a kind of human being that comes into existence that doesn't have the problem we have, where we don't have sophrosune, where we don't know what the right thing is to do? What if there's a species that will follow us, some kind of new man who will evolve, who's born with sophrosune? And because he has sophrosune, he can live a joyful life that's also a wise life and a good life. He's postulating that as an example to hold side by side with the actual examples we see in the world around us, who, you know, are living sort of half lives, not very joyful, not very wise, not very good. And you know, he's trying to explain why this confusion. Why do we lose our way so easily? I think that's what the purpose of the Ubermensch is more than anything. And I think he sums it up when he says man is a sick animal. The cheetah knows what to do, but we don't know what to do. We have a level of confusion that's just bizarre for an actual living species. Maybe it's not an accident we haven't been around for millions of years like a lot of other species. We've only been around for a short time, a few 100,000 years. Maybe we're half baked. Maybe we're not there yet. And his idea of the Ubermensch is, what if we finish baking, and at the end of that baking, we regain the lost capacity for Sofrosune, and then we finally know again what's wise to do, what's good to do, what's lively and vivacious for us to do again. I suspect that's what he's talking about. I'm not going to go into too much detail now, but my critique is I think Nietzsche didn't finish thinking it through. I think it's not an accident that we don't have Sofrosune. I think having Sofrosune at a biological level built into us is incompatible with being able to do so many things, right? The cheetah has limits to what it can do because it's only interested in certain things. And that's great if it's on the plains of the Serengeti where there are gazelles. But it's not so great if the cheetah is in the tundra of Alaska where there aren't any gazelles at all. So there aren't any cheetahs in the tundra of Alaska. There are places the cheetah can't live. It can't go because Sofrosune points it too strongly at a way of life that only works in certain places. For Homo sapiens to become this adaptable species that could live lots of different viable lives in different parts of the world, it means we had to lose our compass so that we could be free to try things that no other animal would try. I don't think you get the one without the other. I think it's a two-edged sword. The problem we have is, I think, part and parcel of the strength that we have. The flexibility means that we also lose our way. If we didn't lose our way, we wouldn't be so flexible. Whether this is viable or not, I have no idea. But I don't, it's partly the result of, another century or so of work on biology and ecology and archaeology and things, information that wasn't available to Nietzsche when he was writing. But I think that's kind of where this is all pointing, is that our missing Sofrosune it's not an accident. It's missing for a reason. And it means that although we can postulate that maybe he's right, that we'll keep evolving and there will be some Ubermensch to come that's the finished, fully baked version of Homo sapiens, I don't think it's as simple as having the joyful, wise, good life that he depicts in Thus Spake Zarathustra. I don't know what it would look like. I'm too trapped in my current world. But anyway, Phil, you got your hand up. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I have.
Oh, and Diana, you want to be in line
Well,
too?
she could go first.
Yeah, quick, because I can't be for.
Oh, that's right. You were in line. You were in line ahead of Phil. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just wanted to address Phil when he was mentioning the tree of knowledge, and so the way I think is the best way to read the Bible is the same way in the medieval times it was done, and it was with a typology, that is the sense in which there's a concrete world and there's a spiritual world here. So as you were talking about the Roman Empire, there's an idea that man has about something higher, like democracy or republic and all those things that seem so smoothly working on the ideal. But then once you put the concrete actively on it, then you realize it seems like it's corrupted. And so why is it this? And so my thing is that, as St. Augustine said, we share reproduction with plants, we share senses with animals, and we share, stupid accent, conscious and language with angels. And so I think the problem of men, of suffering, or at least this is the way I have tried to see it, I have a background in psychology, is that man has a nature that calls for being self-servient. That's our earthly nature. We're made out of the dust, out of the abyss in which God's attributes were not intrinsic in the nature of man. And so we are like the darkness. God didn't create the darkness. There's no day 8, God created the darkness. It's just God created the light and separated it from the darkness. So in the spiritual world, if God is the light, I would say the earthly material which we're made of is the darkness. We self-serve ourselves. which is contrary to the divine holy nature of God. So I feed my hunger by eating me, right? I don't feed my hunger by feeding others. And so what you see in the Garden of Eden is that there's this typology of the use of the Bible in which you can see in the Old Testament. I think in the New Testament it's different, but in the old one, you have a concrete world that reflects, there's a thesis and antithesis, right? And so God tells Adam, you're going to eat from the fruit of the tree and you're going to eat from the herbs of the tree. So Adam's sustenance will come from a higher source, right? Like this elegant, sophisticated reach of source that it was God's presence in the garden. And he's leaning to fulfill his flesh. Sustenance will come from just leaning, getting the herb. Now, what is the first thing that happens after the fall? God says, well, you're not going to eat from the fruit anymore, which we know in the concrete, man eats from the fruit. So it means something different. It means that now man is going to work the land, that his carnal nature and his sustenance is not going to be good. And with Cain is going to even, that's a gradual fall, right? With Cain, you see that Cain reflects the first birth of man, that is sort of earthly made birth, right? We don't decide, it's a corrupted spirit from the beginning, right? And so Cain works the carnal flesh, work his earthly nature. And that's what you see, his offering doesn't suffice God, doesn't please him, because what does mean that you work your carnal nature is that you absorb what's in you, right? It serves, and that's the real abyss of human suffering, is that we're unable to fulfill what sustenance is for man. We're unable to find that sustenance in food. I'm hungry and I eat again and I'm hungry again. And it's a never-ending search for sustenance through the flesh, through the earth, that does not fulfill me. And this is because, again, man is in this kind of point in which you have a spiritual nature that feeds out of giving, like the light it projects. Like you open the door in a dark room and you see how the light kind of brings over from chaos and darkness, it brings purpose to the objects in the room, right? And so when we, as the darkness, let's say, we don't worship God, and that's why God worship me, because if you don't worship what is divine, you will worship what is mundane, what is mundane, what it's has a limit. So I'm just gonna make a little visual here of how I see it. Now, Abel, on the other hand, he controls the flocks of the animal drive, right? He controls the animals, right? And he offers the flesh. And that's what love does, right? When you love somebody, you sacrifice the flesh. You don't eat because you want your son eating. You live in a cheaper place because you want your friend living better, whatever it is, right? But you sacrifice a carnal flesh desire. And that's the second birth. So all the first birth in the Old Testament are going to be hated by God. Esau, he chases wild game. That means he chases wild pleasures. All the chosen men of God are always the second birth, and they're normally shepherds, because shepherds represent the nature of the spirit. You sacrifice the flesh, you control the flock, right? And so if man, sorry, I'm gonna put it here. So if man is gathered up, like this is God the light, and he brings men out of darkness, I don't think it was initially thought that man will be eternally in it. Man had to choose. But he didn't, I don't think God expected man of not falling. He knew he will fall, because you're made out of a carnal nature, a nature that does not reflect the nature of giving, right? And so you don't give will to somebody that you won't give options. It can be. Free will means that you have an option. Now, Adam only had one. We have a 30. Right, but the real abyss is that man tries to look for sustenance where there is not. And so we try to look for light where there's not, right? And so it's the self-serving nature in which I want to help others, but I have this strong drive in which I just want to pleasure myself. And that's what sin does, is that you look at everything with an utilitarian view of how can I use it for my own pleasures. And in that sense, I would say I'm a patriarch in that sense. I agree that the only ethos of men is definitely the absorption of the nature of the darkness that is to absorb the light. We look at everything, how can I use it for me? And that's contrary to God. And so again, but that gave the precondition for love, because that allowed the Creator to come and give his testimony of love to which man can respond, right? We didn't have that precondition. Adam did not love God because he had none of the desire or the expectation that come from needing him. Only after the fall is that I can say, okay, I don't like this. I was born with the heart of a pig. I need a new one. This one sucks, right? And it's very interesting what you're saying about women, and in that sense, as a woman, I agree. I think that the downfall of men is women, and the downfall of women is herself, right? Adam fell for Eve, and Eve fell for herself. And I'm Christian. It normally comes to me that I'm very wary with men sometimes, and I always tell them, be careful with women, because I know what we do. And it's unless you're restrained by, again, language that is given by God, right? If it wasn't because of language, I don't see, there's nothing in nature that forbids men to follow a moral life. And actually, in the Bible says that nature is not subject to God's law, nor it can be, right? Because it's a different nature altogether. And so, yeah, there's nothing in nature that tells man only marry one woman, not at all. It only happens when there's a God that cares about woman, that says, I know woman's heart is going to be jealousy on it, but unless there's a language that manifests those laws of the spirit, there's nothing in nature that calls for the spirit. And so, I think the struggle of men is basically that we are hanging from a string. And for me, that the string is the language and the message of God, right? We're in our dark nature that is desperate to fulfill itself. And there's an abyss. You will never see a promiscuous person thinking it's enough. I'm done, I'm satisfied, that's all I need. Actually, it increases, and the corruption in men, the more it gets to its pleasures, the more it desires them. And that's when God says to Cain, if you try to kill Cain, you're going to get sevenfold. Because if you try to kill your carnal nature, try to fast. After 7 days, it's going to call you sevenfold. You're going to be eating everything in your path. There's nothing that cannot be eaten. Right? The earth is going to remind you that primarily you're made of it. And so God doesn't expect us to kill Cain. He just, as he will tell Cain, if you do the right sacrifices, you'll be fine. If you don't do the right sacrifices, sin lays at the door and its desire is for you. And so if I say, for example, I'm going to kill now all desires come from a biological need. There's no desire that doesn't have a fundamental biological need, right? And so if I have a certain desires of eating or doing anything that my body calls for, and I try to kill it, what I'm going to be doing is something more atrocious, because it's going to come sevenfold, right? So that's why it's so careful to not try to kill the carnal nature of man, but just control it. It needs control, right? Yeah. And so that was my output in it, but I have to go. No.
Thank you for sharing it.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, sorry, it's something very interesting that I remember about St. Augustine. He said something about how, was it Cicero that said, he was talking about the all-powerful attribute of God. And if he is all-powerful, does that mean he can do everything? And in that sense, can God lie? In which, from my perspective, no, he can't, because, I don't know, just God, right? The moment he says it, the moment it is, then it's not a lie, right? And so I agree with St. Augustine when he says the fact that God cannot die doesn't show that he's not powerful. Instead, is that his will reigns and is not bound to the causality that, for example, man is. And he says something very funny, almost, that the destiny of the weak is the will of the strongest. And so God doesn't have anything above him with a will that restrains his, but that he is free to do as his will says without betraying his nature necessarily. So I think that was a smart point from St. Augustine. But yes, I have to go. Thank you so much for inviting me. And,
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Okay. Well, have a beautiful day, everybody.
You too. And, you know, feel free to come back anytime because we do these every week, usually on Mondays at this time.
That's something I will call before. Thank you.
So that was intriguing. So yeah, I mean, you know, she's explaining, you know, the framework quite well. And it's going to give us a lot of food for thought. We're going to come back to these things repeatedly over the course of the next 2 years. So I'm not going to try to engage with it all right now, other than to say, you know, I'm starting out by showing the shocking side, you know, because this is what Kenneth is doing, the side of the medieval worldview that's shocking to the ancients. And that could give the false impression that what we're going to do is spend the whole time talking about, you know, all the vices of the medieval epoch. But that's far from the truth. There are many things that the medieval epoch, the medieval worldview can see more clearly than the ancients could see, more clearly than the moderns, than we can see. Each of these epochs has its things that it can bring into focus, and we'll be getting to that. So anybody who's following along on the YouTube videos, don't let these initial ones lead you to think that we're just going to be dissing on the medieval epoch, because we're not. There's interesting stuff there, but the point is to show the difficulty at the time of emergence that people had with these ideas. There was a struggle because these ideas are so alien and antagonistic to the ancient framework. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Well, what's on my mind has, to a degree, something to do with history. And, you know, like, unfortunately, maybe Christianity, and maybe it's not unfortunate, maybe it's inevitable, that Christianity arose during the Roman period. I mean, if it had embedded itself in the Ptolemaic universe and that survived, maybe it would have been different. But what was just said differs from what happened, because when it's embedded in the Roman civilization, Roman was about a material world. It built a lot of stuff. There was a lot of stuff. There was aqueducts, there was castles, there was roads. All of that is sort of like a kind of military, but also industrial or, you know, economic complex. You know, you could call it the first true military industrial complex, if you want to call it that way. And this history means that when Rome fell, particularly in the Western Empire, there was a fusion between the church, not the pure religion that Christianity was, because it has been transformed. The church was an institution to survive because the church has embedded itself in the former conquered land. You know, they had the spiritual relationship. But the church was a manifestation of a kind of alter, I guess, ideology, you know, alter spiritual relationship. And so there was really a deep relationship between the spirit and the physical world of corruption. And it seems to me Hegel was right about the dialectical history. I mean, that history is, in sense, dialectical idealism was really the history of unfolding. In this case, it unfolded through institutions. I almost think of institution now when I think about it is like it's almost a replacement for Christ. If Christ was the third that linked between the world and the spirits of Augustine, the divine God, in a sense, Christ became an institutional structure that's manifest on earth that replaced that. And so the institution became important. And so when it came to the modern era, it almost seemed like the dialectical uh, idealism manifested in some sense in Adam Smith, and certain political institutions, such as kind of expanding empires and kingdoms. I would say not empires, but kingdoms, and the formation of republics and of some sort. So in some sense, the republics, in some sense, had this sort of dual relationship with institutions. And I think Marx might have been wrong because Marx was a part of that structure, because the economy was a very, very important part, dialectical, about the economic structure, about materialism. And so in some sense, that was manifested in Adam Smith. But there was also a kind of institution of politics and government that in a sense of a dual relationship with that. And I think he went too far in the terms of the dialectical materialism. And so the institutions that survive, I mean, not only formal institution, but the structure of society was that it survived and transcended that. And that's why uh, Lenin, actually, unfortunately, he died, but Lenin went on that sense, and it was subverted by, in a sense, the institutions themselves that eroded it. In fact, to a certain point that they had to come up with the dictatorship of the proletariat, which means a setup of institutions in a sense to contradict that. But unfortunately, by that time, it eroded to such a degree that in the Soviet Union, it had become a kind of gangster economy. So in some sense, it didn't work. It was at the West, it was corrupt, but it hasn't quite become a gangster economy. In other words, what is it? The Godfather had power, but not that much power. I mean, the government still was able to take them down to a certain degree. So I think that's part of the thing, is that so that institution was a kind of earthly manifestation of dialectical idealism, not dialectical materialism, although it's driven. And of course, you could say, well, the Western democracy, the dialectical idealism has become very, very deeply corrupted itself by dialectical materialism, because we know the money funnels into institutions and completely transform the government power to restrict the institutions. So that's what we have. So there's constantly a struggle between dialectical, I guess, idealism and dialectical materialism. But in some sense, I think it was a pure struggle in Western democracies than in Russia, because it became totally corrupt and became, in essence, gangster government, gangster dialectical materialism. And so that's the part of the problem. You took a part of an institution that's supposed to be part of the whole, and then you blow that up. And in some sense, and you expect that people would be good and behave well, but in fact, I think we realize that, like I said, the good, the bad, and the ugly is actually what we have. That's better than a very small good trying to control the big bad and becomes extremely ugly. So I think that's where the problem is. That's what dictatorships have. So I think I always favored Hegel more than Marx, even though I do pay attention to Marx. I think he does have something to say, but I think he was too, in a funny way, he was a little bit too idealistic in his own way. So I think to think of institution as a replacement of the medieval Christ is kind of an interesting thing. How did it take over that relationship? I guess showing
Yeah.
I guess showing icons. At least, well, the Eastern religion that didn't do much good either. If you look at the, the Eastern Christianity, I mean, I guess I don't know what they call the head guy, but what would be equivalent to the Pope?
Patriarch.
Yeah, is blessing Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, a whole bit is like, that, yeah. So that I mean, that has become a kind of duopoly. All right, that's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, some of the things you've talked about, I'm going to save for when we get to the modernity, because some of it is about, how the modern world has responded. But it's good material. I see Ari has his hand up. Hey, Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey guys, yeah, I've been listening very patiently, and it's been an exciting conversation. A lot of stuff that is near and dear to my heart, and so much. So I'll try not to talk for too long, but I come back to this idea of seeing humans in this conversation of lacking. So for Sune is basically we're the first organisms that primarily reproduce through what we've talked about previously, or I've sort of previously said more as mimetic transmission. The scholar that I reference most who talks about this in its pure sense for the informational genome of a civilization is Yuval Harari. He talks about the way we have genes, which is packages of information through proteins that then somehow have some sort of symbolic representation in terms of function through that structure, which is also a big mystery. How can you get these chemicals to actually make these actions? Similarly, we have these symbolic representations, which I think Diana said so nicely, through language is the primary vessel of mimetic transmission, where we categorize things in new and creative ways. And we're able to create concepts through these categories. And then these concepts essentially fight for survival in people building civilizations through culture going to war with each other, either through actual physical wars or just perhaps we've said spiritual wars or ideological wars, or in modern sense, I don't want to talk about modern too much, but it still applies in the old senses, economic wars, like what really works, what keeps the society and I think we talked about this before, from a mythos, from a mythological point of view, what's the glue that holds the society together and keeps everybody working as an ant colony according to the same sort of rules? Well, if they have the same ideas and then they can transmit these ideas, then they can function as a system that passes information accurately, and then to some degree is self-sacrificial. I think of like an army, the front lines dies, but if they don't run away, then it's usually in war, whichever group breaks first. And usually that's something like 10% casualties is never achieved without breaking, meaning if one side has 10% casualties, their morale is crushed. I mean, I think a few examples of the opposite, of the exception to this, are like the Japanese super morality in World War II. They were their morale was unshakable, and they were so dedicated to the idea of their way of life and the emperor and the way that a soldier was, to some degree. This is Dan Carlin talking about. He's a different historian. He's not actually a historian, but he talks about this a lot in his thing called Hardcore History. They found Japanese soldiers on islands, who lived there for like 20 years, and they actually had to go get his commanding officer to come to the island to get the guy out, because otherwise he wasn't going to give up. This is how strong their morale, their belief in their meme was, right? And the reason I bring this up specifically, and there's a nice way to say that's also talking about, we're going to bring up maybe if I have a little time, talk about the religiosity from a little bit from a mythological point of view of like the Jewish culture. And again, I think Rick would say this is a nice way. This is a modern version, but again, what does modern mean? Maybe it's like 2,000 years old. But at the same time, it's a new creation that that sort of eats the old creation and destroys the old one, so the old one doesn't exist anymore. So it's a conversation for us, as opposed to the old version was a conversation for them, and we don't have access to that conversation. And the way that this is often seen in the Jewish tradition, especially if in the Talmud, there's two types of people writing the Talmud. There's a Tana, which is an old writer, and an Amora, which is like a novel new writer. And oftentimes there's a rule that the Amora, the new guy, is not allowed to contradict the old guy, right? He has to build on the framework. But there's a strange paradox that sometimes he can just reinterpret the old guy, which essentially destroys the old guy, but allows for the new guy. And there's this idea like, what if these two guys meet in heaven? Isn't the Tana, the old guy, going to be pissed at the new guy? You know, he's like, how dare you destroy my translation, my interpretation? And the idea is, no, the new stuff is for the new group of people, and they're both simultaneously valid for different times for different groups. And there's neither one is right and neither one is wrong. They're both mythologies that are quote unquote useful and helpful to guide the people at that time. So there isn't sort of a contradiction as much as there's a weird form of collaboration. So I buy into this version of mimetic transmission a lot. To the older version of ideas, they're not wrong. They're just not for us. That's not our conversation, you know. And again, I like your idea way back. It's like if they're talking about dinosaurs and we're talking about dinosaurs, our conversation about dinosaurs is totally useful in some ways. It's just a totally different context, which makes sense because our context is different than their context. And this is the idea of memes in general, and ideas in language. Language is completely contextually based. I mean, this is going to get to. I didn't think I was going to get into this, but Chomsky's understanding of he's got a very beautiful like hierarchy of language. There's like regular language and then context language and then context-free language and then basically self-referential language. And these are the types of languages, how complex they can be, where you can embed statements within others. And on a simple level, you know, you have this just regular language, one symbol for one object. So in semiology, this is a linguistics thing, and this is also kind of where Harari talks about mimetic transmission. You have a symbol, which is some abstract group of sounds like blah, right? And that represents this thing called an apple. Well, for our language, it's an apple, right? But you have one word for one concept, and that it's like a real world correlate to the symbol, and this is called a signal and a signifier. So the signifier is the real world thing that's out there. And the signal is this informational transmission. And this is also what genes do, right? They have this weird coding of a symbol, and then you get arms and legs or frogs or whatever it is, right? Into the very microscopic as well. And you have this genetic version of this, but you also now, what humans have is a newer level clearly of life doing something new, which is mimetic transmission. And this is where I look at the apple and the Garden of Eden sort of thing, what's going on here. And this is Harari specifically, and this is actually the Jewish version. It's the most it's like everything in Judaism, between the Jewish scholars, they argue about what's right and wrong. And all the possibilities are somewhere in between there, and they're all right and wrong at the same time. But one of the most common interpretations of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil is it's actually wheat. And there's this idea in the ancient temple to fix the problem of the wrongness of the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, it's called in Hebrew, that you have these things called the showbreads. And so you have this original form of wheat, which is this base nature thing. And then humans go and add on to this and make it better by turning it into cooking, so to speak. And this is where humans cannot perfect nature, but we improve upon nature. And this is the idea that ideas themselves improve upon nature. They're a new form. And so what happens here, according to Harari, is the wheat represents the shift from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural society. And you see here specifically, again, this is nice with I didn't want to jump too far, but it's so beautiful of Nietzsche that we see what's happening in the medieval era versus the ancient era. The ancient era had the characteristics, like the ethos, all this idea that a person of good character will then lead and rule, and then a society should be of good character based on good people. And you see that fail. Well, that's that mimetic idea, that governance of that's the supreme meme of that time, that's survival, that's the Darwinist apex predator, well, it dies, it fails. And in this case, what's happening is human beings are being saddled like horses, so to speak, by these ideas, and then they change the way we behave, specifically agriculturalism. This is a hypothesis that's a pretty darn good one about why we would theoretically go from a much more stable, healthy, happy, less work, less pain version of hunter and gathering, where we had to work maybe 10 to 20 hours a week as an individual in a really prolific environment, and people had their societal needs met for social interaction on a much more rich, complicated level as little tribes. Why would we go to all of a sudden serving wheat, where we care more about the wheat living than our some of our population living? And it's the idea we became addicted or dependent on the wheat, or specifically we became dependent on the meme, the idea of agriculturalism. And this is where the idea that the knowledge of good and evil that we can no longer go without is an idea that saddles us. And knowledge of good and evil itself is an idea that saddles us. And a more advanced idea that he doesn't really develop so well in his book of Sapiens is this idea that we're saddling each other, that there's a mutual saddling between the horse and the rider, and that now they're able to do more together. But at the same time, they don't have sophor sune in this classical sense of a biological sheet. Like, what's the horse and the rider going to do now? They're a new creation in a new environment. The only thing that makes sense here is the sophor sune has to do with sort of figuring out how to saddle ideas and be saddled by them in sort of this new world of ideas sort of being the dominant form of informational transmission through civilization and culture. And specifically, you see that the question that I want that keeps coming back that's so interesting, that I believe in this sort of Darwinism of there are genes that are just dominant. Like, for instance, it's clear that a cheetah is going to be a much more successful predator for gazelle than, let's say, a small fox, right? The fox doesn't have what it takes. So the fox sophor sune is great for rodents, but he's not the apex predator, so to speak, that some of the higher level predators are. And then humans, to some degree, with the ability of mimetic transmission, become the ultimate apex predator in some at least short-term way. And it seems strange to me that the idea of God and this idea of an omnipotent God, which, by the way, isn't really a Jewish thing that I wanted to kind of get into, that it's really a romantic idea that's really fraught with a lot of holes, that if you think about it, is that anything that exists that has a function, i.e. God creates and makes stuff, well, in order just to have function, you have to have structure. Like, it's impossible. And this is sort of, therefore, if you're going to have structure, you have internal limitations. And it's by virtue that God is creative and destructive, perhaps at the same time, both these things. Therefore, it has to have a nature. And so there's a famous Jewish scholar that many of you may have heard of called Maimonides. He's written a book called The Guide to Perplex. He's written a bunch of things. He's one of the most celebrated Jewish scholars of all time. That there's like half of Judaism called the Sephardic culture that pretty much follows his rules entirely, which is unheard of, that you just follow one guy's interpretation. Normally, it's a whole mixture of almost a pantheon of rabbis that you sort of pick and choose your culture. Like, what do you do in these certain situations? But no, he's so amazing that like half of the Jewish culture that was very, very prolific, called the Sephardim, which is more like the Mediterranean versus the European or the Ashkenazim, they 100% go with his interpretations. And he says explicitly that there are 13 attributes of God. And these attributes are not necessarily his nature, but it's his behaviors in this world. So it's all we have access to. And it's, again, that this idea, I think we said it earlier, way back, that humans don't have access to reality. We have access to descriptions of reality. And then from a neuroscience point of view, if you're bringing in modern technology, which works here too, is we have these descriptions are really simulations of reality. And they're based on categories. And the categories are based on language. And these are what ideas form for us. They form a simulation of reality. You know, the color red is not actually some specific bandwidth in the frequency of light. It's just something we've categorized, and that when we see, we perceive. And it's this idea that categories create perception, and that we construct categories much more on the fly. And they're not these universal things in the the Platonic forms. The Platonic forms are if there is such a thing, it's more like we create them at every moment as we create and recombine categories. And there's sort of this ongoing mimetic competition. So if there's this ongoing mimetic competition, it gets back to how the heck did an omnipotent God, this thing that breaks all the rules of previous societies, foundational structures of how people make decisions and based on limitations, you get this thing that's infinity that just ruins it all. How does that conquer all of those memes? Think about it from a genetic point of view. This becomes the new apex predator. There's like 2.4 billion Christians. There's 1.3 Muslims. There's very few Jews, but the Jews do a lot more than they generally do in the numbers. I think Dan Carlin says this again about Jews, is they're just like everybody else, only more so. And it's a funny idea that somehow, especially in this era, and also for the Jewish people, that there's this meme that, whether you say it's always been there from the beginning and it's been fighting off fake memes, or there's a pantheon of memes and it dominated them all, whichever narrative you want to go for, it really doesn't matter. The narrative is that this meme dominated, absolutely. I mean, completely devastated. We talked about this to some degree a couple of weeks ago. The death of the Jewish state, of the temples being destroyed, allowed for the Christian Jesus meme to really take fold. And then, because it was much more universal, instead of just being this one tribe gets to have access to the supreme God, now everybody gets to have access to the supreme God. And there's this universality to it. And this is where Harari talks about the power of memes being really important, is if you're going to have a top-down legislation, which is basically a dictator in terms of mimetic form, it needs to be universally applied to everybody. Now it's not just a God for this tribe. It's not just a God that applies to men or women or old people. It's everybody. And everybody can grab onto this God. And you could do it through the power of either, whether it's like being with Jesus. I mean, this is Simone Weil's interpretation. You want to bond with Jesus himself. This is a universal thing that everybody can do, right? So somehow this meme in the medieval era takes hold, and of course it gets corrupted. We'll talk about that. But the thing that's so satisfyingly interesting for me is this meme becomes so universally dominant, and then it fails. And then you have the modern era, which we'll get to in a couple of years, probably, as Rick says. But it's the meme of its epoch, right? That is the apex predator. And I feel like I don't know if Kenneth Smith would agree with this, but it almost feels like what he's saying, that there's a governing meme, that the apex predator meme for each epoch. I would say the modern one is probably capitalism, or the state and the market. But you see this one, the medieval one, is clearly this omnipotent God. And then we said before that the ancient one is this sort of characteristics of the sophorsune that was totally. Sophorsune doesn't exist in the medieval era. That's now God is the only thing that has sophorsune.
Right.
So it's really fascinating to me that all of this, but there's an eating, there's a what is it? An extinction level event that's happening between the ancients and the moderns, and it's because of this apex predator meme that just sweeps in and it dominates completely.
Yes, I agree completely.
I think it's a good place to finish this little soliloquy.
Right. It's fascinating. It's real. The relationships between these things are just fascinating. And what they do is they take what, as moderns, raised as moderns, we just take for granted, and they convert it into something understandable. And they reveal it's like discovering your genealogy for the first time. And you're like, oh, that's why we do this. Oh, that's why that happened. It's like suddenly a life that just seems to be just what it is for no particular reason, it takes on all this meaning because we can see.
I want, if you don't mind, I'd like to add one more point. I'll try to be brief about it. It's throwing in Richard Dawkins, who funnily is an atheist, but he says so many things that are so spiritual. He talks about how any organism is a model of the universe itself or its environment. And he uses the perfect example that's pretty easy to conceptualize as a stick bug. A stick bug is a model of the forest itself, right? And so ideas themselves, concepts, are a model of some sort of reality. And it's the models that are most successful are generally the memes that that reproduce the best. So there's this weird inherent argument that seems very seductive and probably full of delusion that a God that's singularly powerful sort of maybe represents something more accurate about the universe. Like we're in one universe, we're in one reality, as opposed to, or there's sets of universal laws like physics that apply universally to everyone. That was new with Newton. Newton was the first to say that the laws of physics apply to everybody similarly, and they're not just these weird, come and go as they will forces. So there's some sort of universality of it. And again, this is Harari saying the power of a really good meme is how universal it is. And then Richard Dawkins would say, well, how much it actually is a model for its environment. And I was hoping we could explore the actual almost biology or physiology of these ideas in terms of like, how are they modeling their reality? How are they conquering other memes, right? How is there sort of a Darwinian survival mechanism going on here, but not in the world of the physical, but in the world of the pure imagination? It's a completely, information, even through genes. Genes do their thing, that ability to go from a physical form to a function, there has to be an information in there which is purely non-physical.
Yes.
And that's what generally in neuroscience or in life they call it memory. But memory is essentially non-physical. It's some sort of simulation of reality, a modeling of reality. That's a big mystery, I think, to everybody. So,
yeah, I mean, what your core interest here is going to be one of the core foci for the next 2 years of discussions about the medieval epoch, because the goal of the medieval epoch was to establish a single orthodox meme, and they both succeeded and failed at the same time, because so many counter memes arose in response to the effort to impose a single one, that you get this proliferation of concepts about the nature of God, and questions get asked that the original, orthodox position, around the year 500, those people couldn't have imagined that we were going to be, really exploring those aspects of what does it mean to be divine and so forth. So,
well, this actually sounds a lot like genetic adaptation, where you start with one gene, and then all of a sudden, 1,000 years later, you have a tremendous amount of mutated forms of that gene. They're doing all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really interesting, and part of the reason is that it's harder to see in the ancient world because they didn't have that concept of a single orthodox position. The polytheism militated against it. But the moment you start to get this idea of monotheism spreading widely, then it becomes really clear. You can sort of see what's a counter reaction to what. The what do I want to say? The cause and effect gets clearer.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. But anyway, I know Phil has his hand up, but we got to wrap up because we're after time. So I'm gonna call it a close, Phil. I hope you can hang on to the idea or email me, but I'm gonna wrap it up here. And say I had a lovely time. I hope you guys had a lovely time.
Yeah.
And I'll talk to you all next Monday.
Go ahead.
Sounds great.
Take care, everyone.
Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, Donald, wait.